When Caesarius left Chalons, then moved through Lerins and finally reached Arles, he was not simply changing location. He was moving from the outer edge of the Roman world into one of its deepest and oldest Mediterranean centres. Provence had belonged to Rome for centuries, before the Visigoths took control in the late 5th century, and among all the regions of Gaul, it had absorbed Roman life more completely than almost any other. To many ancient observers, this land felt less like a distant province and more like an extension of Italy itself. Its rivers, especially the Rhone, opened toward the Mediterranean, and that sea shaped everything around it. The crops, the climate, and the rhythm of life all seemed closer to northern Italy than to the colder and rougher lands farther inland in Gaul. Here, olives, figs, and vines thrived. Here, wine and tunics belonged to ordinary life. In other parts of Gaul, older customs remained stronger and daily habits could feel very different. Provence stood apart. It was into this highly Roman and deeply Mediterranean world that Caesarius arrived, and more precisely into Arles and its surrounding countryside. Yet Arles was nothing like the quiet monastic setting of Lerins, where he had formed his spiritual ideals. This was not a secluded island of prayer and silence. Arles was a busy river port, noisy, crowded, worn by movement and trade. Its territory stretched across strikingly different landscapes, from the marshes of the Camargue in the south to the rocky plains in the east, and the hills and mountains to the north. The people of this region had long established habits, loyalties, and sacred traditions. Their culture had deep roots in both the distant past and the realities of daily survival. Greek and Roman influence had changed this world slowly over time, but much of its older character remained alive. Christianity, when it came, did not enter empty ground. It entered a land that already had its own social values, religious expectations, and cultural memory. To understand what Caesarius was trying to do as bishop, it is not enough to describe his beliefs. It is necessary to understand the society into which he brought them, the political order of the city, the structure of its communities, the religious customs people already practiced, and the traditions that resisted Christian reshaping. Late Roman Arles can only be understood against the background of its earlier Roman development, because so much of what survived in late antiquity had been formed centuries before. Arles itself stood on a limestone height rising above the Rhone and the surrounding wetlands. The site had been occupied since very early times, probably by a Celto-Ligurian people connected to the wider tribal world of southern Gaul. Its position gave it immense strategic value. It lay at the first major landing point for ships moving upriver, at one of the best places to cross the Rhone, and at the centre of a watery landscape of marshes, lakes, and channels that could be navigated by flat-bottomed boats and barges. Nearby forests supplied wood for shipbuilding, while the delta and surrounding plains supported fishing, salt production, shellfish gathering, livestock, and Mediterranean agriculture. This was not an isolated settlement. From the beginning, it was a place where transport, natural resources, and geography combined to create opportunity. Greek merchants from Marseille quickly recognized that value. From the late 6th century before Christ, Greek influence became visible in Arles through imported fine pottery and signs of planned urban development. The settlement may even have functioned as a Greek trading outpost linking the Mediterranean coast to the interior of Gaul. For a time, it also carried a Greek name. Yet local elites later reasserted themselves, and the older native identity of the place returned. Even so, Greek communities remained active nearby, especially in the Camargue, where trade in fish, salt, and fish sauce continued. Long before Roman power arrived in full force, Arles had already become a meeting point between native traditions and the wider Mediterranean world. Rome first appeared in southern Gaul through commerce and alliance, especially through its ties with Marseille. Over time, trade increased, military cooperation deepened, and Roman intervention expanded. By the late 2nd century before Christ, southern Gaul had effectively become a Roman province. Rome secured the region to protect Italy, maintain access to Spain, and open new land to Roman settlement. Local elites, whether Greek or native, were quick to understand the advantages of working with the new power. Many entered networks of patronage, administration, and trade, and some became very wealthy. Latin became increasingly important in these circles, and Roman culture followed. Yet beneath this process of adaptation, resentment, and local resistance did not disappear, especially among non-elites. Even so, the province became an important Roman base, and Arles itself gained greatly from the shift. Its true rise began during the civil wars at the end of the Roman Republic. Marseille backed Pompey, while Arles supported Caesar. When Marseille fell, Arles was rewarded with much of its former territory. Soon afterward, it was established as a colony for veterans of Caesar's army, and its status was later confirmed again under Octavian. From that point forward, Arles was no longer simply an old native settlement shaped by Greek trade. It became a Roman colony with growing prestige, official status, and a new civic identity. Under the imperial reorganization of southern Gaul, Arles became the capital of one of the largest districts in Provence. Its territory was divided into smaller local zones, with their own centres, villages, and market towns. Some of these smaller places would later become bishoprics themselves, showing how durable this Roman administrative map would be. The physical appearance of Arles also changed decisively under Roman rule. In the late 1st century before Christ, the lower ground between the hill and the river was laid out with a regular street plan. A main boulevard cut through the city, crossed by an important east-west road. Near their intersection stood the Forum, the heart of civic life. Around it rose the monuments that marked Arles as unmistakably Roman. A theatre, an amphitheatre, baths, an aqueduct, and a circuit wall with towers and gates. Outside the walls, suburban districts developed with workshops, shops, baths, houses decorated with mosaics, docks, warehouses, and shipyards. Across the Rhône, the district, later called Trinquetaille, was linked to the city by a bridge of boats and served as a major centre of shipping and storage. Burial grounds, according to Roman custom, spread along the roads beyond the walls. The city had been reshaped into a Roman urban world of spectacle, movement, administration, and commerce. This transformation depended heavily on local aristocrats. Wealthy citizens sought honour through public office, priesthoods, benefactions, and gifts to the city. They funded games, monuments, and public celebrations. Their fortunes, however, came mainly from the countryside. The comforts and prestige of city life rested on the agricultural productivity of the rural estates around Arles. Roman colonization and land registration changed that countryside profoundly. Land was surveyed, distributed, and taxed in new ways. Roman veterans received allotments, and the registration of property likely led to disputes, seizures, and a concentration of land in the hands of those powerful enough to claim it. Much about the earlier rural landscape remains unclear, but it is certain that Roman rule disrupted older patterns of ownership and settlement. One visible result was the spread of villas. These were not merely country houses, they were centres of agricultural production, built on stone foundations and often furnished with considerable luxury. Some continued earlier Greek traditions of rural investment, but many more were established under Roman rule. They formed part of a system designed not only for local subsistence, but for wider markets. Grain, oil, wine, and other products moved through this network, feeding both towns and long-distance commerce. A massive watermill complex at Barbegal shows the scale that production could reach. At the same time, the countryside did not become a world of slave gangs alone. Smaller tenant farms and peasant households remained important. Romanization altered the rural economy, but it did not erase older village life. Settlement patterns changed as well. During the Roman period, many people moved away from fortified hilltop sites and into lower, more accessible plains. Villages became centres not only of habitation but also of trade, craft activity, and transport. Roads, bridges, river crossings, and canals improved movement through the region. For Arles, the Rhône remained the essential artery, and the canal linking it to the sea strengthened the city's role as a transfer point between inland Gaul and the Mediterranean. Goods from overseas arrived by sea, were shifted at Arles, and then continued inland by river traffic. Goods from the interior travelled in the opposite direction. The city also redistributed products from its own countryside and received imported objects in return. Marshes and lakes around Arles were themselves part of this transport system, crossed by shallow craft and rafts. Arles thrived because it connected land, river, and sea more effectively than almost any other city in the region. Yet Roman prosperity did not erase native identity. The population of the territory continued to preserve deep elements of its older culture, especially in religion. Across the city, the towns and the countryside, different communities maintained their own systems of values, loyalties, and sacred practices. Each community had its own sense of honour, well-being, prosperity, and divine favour. In some places, these values aligned closely with the ideals of Roman civic life. In others, especially farther from the urban centre, older traditions remained stronger. This diversity mattered enormously, and because Christianity would later spread not into a single cultural world, but into many different local worlds, each with its own religious habits. A revealing example comes from a village called Gargarius. An inscription shows that its inhabitants acted together to defend a civic privilege they believed belonged to them. They had lost access to free use of water and baths, something they had enjoyed for decades. To recover it, they turned to a wealthy and well-connected patron from Arles, who carried their appeal all the way through imperial channels. The villagers later honoured him publicly for his effort. This episode shows that even a rural community shared important values with the city. Access to baths represented civilized life, dignity, and public benefit. But the story also reveals hierarchy. The villagers had enough solidarity to act together, yet they still needed an urban patron to achieve results. Their community was real, but so were its limits. Religion reflected these differences even more clearly. In Roman Arles itself, official public religion followed the civic and imperial forms of the Roman world. Sacrifices, festivals, processions, games, and public priesthoods honoured Roman gods and the emperor. The imperial cult flourished, and the city recognised the familiar gods of the Mediterranean pantheon. At the same time, mystery cults and Eastern religious influences also appeared. Yet older local gods never vanished. Some were simply given Roman names. Others continued to be honoured without disguise. Inscriptions preserve traces of regional deities, local protective spirits, and sacred powers whose names were rooted in the indigenous past. Roman religion in Arles was therefore not a clean replacement of one system by another. It was a layered world where Roman, local, and imported practices existed side by side. This pattern became even clearer beyond the city. In other towns, such as Glanum, Roman cults were certainly present, but indigenous religion remained especially strong. Springs, caves, mountains, groves, and other places in the landscape retained sacred significance. Local gods connected with healing, fertility, protection, and nature continued to receive offerings. In the villages and rural districts, the old religions were even more deeply rooted. Some communities worshipped gods known nowhere else. Others honoured local versions of wider Celtic deities, especially mother goddesses tied to water, fertility, and land. The countryside was filled with sacred places rather than monumental temples alone. Worship happened beside springs, in open spaces, in groves, at hillsides, and near lakes and rivers. Sacrifices, vows, prayers, processions, and seasonal celebrations tied religion directly to the land and to survival. That persistence is not surprising. Romanization moved unevenly, and religion was the part of culture people abandoned most slowly. Many peasants continued speaking their older language long after Roman political control had become normal. Traditional names also endured. For those living near the social margins, far from the centres of Roman administration and elite culture, there was little reason to replace local religious practices that had shaped communal life for generations. Even among those who had adopted Latin and absorbed parts of Roman culture, older gods could remain meaningful under Roman forms. Cultural adaptation often meant translation rather than surrender. Above all, people in the countryside depended directly on the natural forces around them. Rain, fertility, livestock, health, and harvest were not abstract concerns. They were matters of survival. A tradition believed to protect those things was not easily abandoned. In the 3rd century, this world was shaken. After centuries of relative stability, southern and central Gaul entered a period of crisis marked by invasions, political unrest, and imperial fragmentation. In Arles, buildings outside the walls were destroyed and then abandoned. Similar patterns appeared elsewhere in the region. Villas were left empty, towns suffered damage, and older hill sites or caves were temporarily reoccupied. Whether every case resulted directly from attack or from the wider insecurity of the time, the result was the same. The old confidence of the Roman world had been broken. Provence did not collapse entirely, but it experienced the same instability that affected much of the Western Empire. Arles, however, recovered strongly in the 4th century and entered a new phase of prominence. Its location made it strategically ideal. Positioned between northern Italy and the western provinces, and connected by major river and land routes, it became increasingly important to imperial government. Emperors resided there. The mint of Ostia was transferred there. The city acquired a new name linked to Constantine's house, and its status rose further when major offices of government shifted westward toward it. Eventually, Arles became one of the great administrative capitals of Roman Gaul. It served as a centre of prefectural, diocesan, and provincial government, and an annual gathering place for officials of the wider region. As imperial priorities changed and older frontiers became harder to defend, Arles grew into a western political hub, almost a smaller Rome for Gaul. This brought major changes to urban life. Imperial residence required baths, palaces, administrative buildings, treasuries, workshops, and a larger resident population of officials, craftsmen, and labourers. Demand for food, housing, manufactured goods, and luxury imports increased. Areas outside the walls that had once been ruined were partly reoccupied, though not with the same forms of elite housing as before. Wealthy residents likely preferred more secure locations within the walls or in protected rural villas. Trade continued to flourish. Arles remained the key transfer point between the Mediterranean and inland Gaul. while also serving as a market for local agricultural production and imported goods from afar. The city's commercial energy remained one of its defining features. Even amid these changes, many familiar patterns of Roman urban life endured. The Forum still functioned as a public centre. Entertainment continued. Circus games were still held. Daily life remained full of movement, conversation, spectacle, and social competition. Yet beneath these continuities, the city was changing in a more profound way. Christian festivals, churches, and bishops were beginning to reshape the civic landscape and offer new ways of building unity, expressing status, and organising public life. Christianity had arrived in Gaul relatively late, and in Arles it first becomes visible only in the mid-3rd century. For a long time, the Christian community remained small and difficult to trace. The real turning point came under Constantine. Once the emperor openly supported Christianity, the religion gained prestige and public presence. In 314, Arles hosted a major council of bishops called to deal with the Donatist dispute. That decision gave the city unusual prominence. It also showed that Christian leaders were no longer being treated as heads of a private sect alone. They were being drawn into the public life of the empire, expected to contribute to unity and order on an imperial scale. By the 4th century, wealthy Christians had clearly become visible in Arles. One of the strongest signs of this is the number of Christian sarcophagi found there. These marble coffins, often imported and richly carved, were expensive and belonged mainly to the upper levels of society. Their presence shows that Christianity had already gained a significant foothold among affluent families, including members of the imperial and local elite. Inscriptions confirm this picture. Men and women of high standing connected to office and rank were being buried as Christians. That did not mean the city as a whole had become Christian, but it did mean that Christianity had reached people capable of funding buildings, shaping taste, and influencing public culture. The first cathedral and baptistery of Arles were probably built in the age of Constantine. Their location is telling. They stood within the walls, which gave them status, but far from the forum and the main monumental heart of the city. This was a careful kind of visibility. The Christian community was recognized, yet not placed in direct competition with the strongest symbols of traditional urban life. Outside the walls, 2 other Christian sites became especially important. Both were linked to Genesius, the martyr who became the city's first great patron saint. One sanctuary marked the place of his martyrdom in Trinquetel. The other stood over his burial place in the Arles camps. Cemeteries developed around both. Christians visited them on his feast day, and processions moved beyond the normal living space of the city into sacred zones shaped by memory, martyrdom, and the hope of divine power. These ritual movements helped Christians imagine the city in new ways. By the middle of the 5th century, those Christian celebrations had become major events. One story from the period describes a huge crowd gathering before dawn for the feast of Genesius. Men, women, children, slaves, elegant young women wearing jewellery, horses richly adorned, vessels carried by servants, all moved together toward the saint's sanctuary. The bridge of boats across the Rhone gave way under the weight of the crowd, throwing people and animals into the river. The bishop prayed, and the disaster turned into a miracle story of rescue. Whatever the details, the narrative reveals something important. By then, the cult of the saint was no longer a marginal devotion. It drew large numbers from both city and countryside, including the wealthy. Christian ritual had become a public event woven into the life of Arles itself. During the first half of the 5th century, Christian building activity accelerated. A new cathedral dedicated to St. Stephen was erected near the Forum, in a much more central and prestigious location than the earlier church. A new baptistery followed, together with an episcopal residence and living quarters for clergy. This was a major symbolic shift. Christianity was no longer remaining at the edge of civic space. It was moving toward the middle of the city's public world. Other churches also appeared, and by the end of the century, a monastery for men had been established on an island just outside the city. Christian leaders were not only building places of worship, they were gradually redirecting the city's visual and social centre. Even materials from older Roman monuments were taken and reused in Christian construction. The old city was not destroyed all at once, but it was being reworked, reinterpreted, and slowly claimed. Still, the process was incomplete. The Forum remained standing and active. Traditional entertainment did not vanish overnight. The theatre itself continued in use. Arles, in late antiquity, was not a city where one world had suddenly replaced another. It was a city where Roman institutions, local memories, old cults, Christian devotion, imperial government, trade, and social ambition all overlapped. That was the world Caesarius entered. He arrived not in a blank landscape waiting for reform, but in a place layered with centuries of power, ritual, identity, and resistance. His task was not merely to teach Christian ideals. It was to make those ideals take root in one of the most complex and deeply formed urban societies in the Western Mediterranean. During the early and middle decades of the 5th century, the city of Arles gradually began to transform its physical appearance in a striking way. New churches rose across the urban landscape. Basilicas were constructed for public worship. Baptisteries were built for the growing number of new believers, and monasteries appeared as centres of discipline and religious life. Although the exact individuals responsible for each building cannot always be identified, the motives behind this wave of construction are not difficult to understand. In earlier centuries, powerful citizens had gained prestige by funding theatres, amphitheatres, and public arenas for entertainment. These grand projects allowed aristocrats to present themselves as generous benefactors of their cities. By the 5th century, however, the cultural language of prestige had changed. Patronage increasingly expressed itself through religious construction. Wealthy patrons and influential bishops now gained honour not by sponsoring games or spectacles, but by building churches and sacred institutions that served the Christian community. This change was closely connected to the gradual conversion of the aristocracy. As more members of the elite embraced Christianity, and as many of them began to enter the ranks of the clergy or even the episcopate, a new style of patronage emerged. Christian generosity replaced civic spectacle. Wealth that might once have produced arenas or baths was now directed toward churches large enough to host growing congregations. Baptisteries were especially important since baptism marked entry into the Christian community. As the number of believers increased, these buildings had to accommodate large public ceremonies that could welcome entire groups of converts at once. In certain cases, when a bishop himself sponsored the construction of a new cathedral, the significance of such projects became even greater. The bishop was not only serving the needs of the faithful, but also strengthening his own position within the city. A monumental cathedral provided a visible stage upon which episcopal authority could be displayed. Within its walls, the bishop preached, administered sacraments, and presided over public gatherings of the Christian population. The building itself became a symbol of leadership, demonstrating both the bishop's devotion and his influence over the urban community. At the same time, the Christian appearance of Arles needed to match the growing ecclesiastical importance of the city. As Arles rose in administrative significance within the late Roman world, its churches, monasteries, and religious institutions also had to reflect that elevated status. While these changes unfolded rapidly within the city, the spread of Christianity in the countryside advanced more slowly. Over the course of the 4th and 5th centuries, however, the rural landscape around Arles began to change as well. Gradually, a network of village churches and rural parishes emerged across the region. This development followed patterns visible in many other parts of Gaul. Early signs of rural clergy appear already in the early 4th century, suggesting that priests and deacons were beginning to operate outside the main urban centre. Yet clearly defined rural parishes appear only later. By the early 5th century, there were references to Christian communities located in villages within the territory of Arles. These early rural parishes appeared first in places closely connected to the city itself. Villages that maintained strong economic and social ties with Arles were naturally the most open to the new religious influence flowing outward from the urban centre. In such communities, the construction of a village church might result either from the pastoral concern of a bishop or from the generosity of a local aristocrat wishing to demonstrate piety and influence. Once a church was built and clergy were assigned to serve it, a parish effectively came into existence. Similar developments soon appeared in other settlements throughout the territory. Rural churches were not limited to villages alone. Some were established in fortified settlements or small administrative centres, while others appeared on large estates owned by the church itself. In certain cases, the church created parishes specifically for agricultural workers living on ecclesiastical lands. Large landowners also began building private churches on their estates. These chapels served the families of the estate owners, as well as the slaves and tenant farmers, who lived and worked on the surrounding land. Over time, many of these private churches gained recognition as official parish centres, serving the wider rural population. By the end of the 5th century, the Diocese of Arles likely contained a few dozen rural parishes. The exact number remains uncertain, but comparisons with other regions of Gaul suggest that the total may have been somewhere between 20 and 25. Although modest by later medieval standards, this network represented a significant extension of Christian presence beyond the city walls. Once established, these parishes performed several essential functions. They served as local centres for baptism, allowing rural inhabitants to enter the Christian faith without travelling to the city. They provided places where the Mass could be celebrated regularly. Parish clergy also carried out instruction, teaching basic elements of Christian belief to the rural population. Despite these responsibilities, however, the authority of rural clergy remained extremely limited. Village churches were still considered extensions of the cathedral church in Arles. Priests and deacons who served in them operated under strict episcopal supervision. Their role was largely administrative and liturgical rather than independent or pastoral. They could read passages from the scriptures during worship, but they were not permitted to interpret them publicly. The right to preach sermons remained the exclusive privilege of the bishop. Likewise, offerings given at parish churches were controlled by the bishop rather than the local clergy. The bishop determined how these resources would be distributed. As a result, priests and deacons had little opportunity to function as influential leaders within their own communities. This limited authority reflected broader attitudes among many bishops of the 4th and 5th centuries. Urban leaders of the church tended to feel more comfortable dealing with aristocrats and city dwellers than with rural peasants. The world of villages and farms remained somewhat distant from their daily experience. Only a few exceptional figures devoted serious attention to the conversion of rural populations. One of the most famous examples was Martin of Tours, who actively travelled through the countryside destroying pagan shrines and preaching among peasants. Yet such figures were rare. Because bishops did not always focus directly on rural evangelization, much of the practical responsibility for spreading Christianity in the countryside fell to aristocratic landowners. These landowners possessed immense authority over the people living on their estates. Their tenants and slaves depended on them for protection, work, and security. When such powerful figures adopted Christianity and supported local churches, they could strongly influence the religious behaviour of the people under their control. Through this combination of aristocratic influence, parish clergy, and occasional episcopal intervention, large numbers of rural inhabitants gradually adopted at least the outward practices of Christianity by the end of the 5th century. The deeper transformation of rural beliefs, however, remained a slow and uneven process. During this same period, another development was unfolding within the structure of the church itself. The city of Arles began to seek greater ecclesiastical authority within Gaul. Throughout most of the 4th century, Arles had been only the centre of a local diocese. That diocese belonged to a larger ecclesiastical province whose capital was located in the city of Vienne. As Arles grew in political importance within the late Roman administrative system, however, its bishops began to argue that the city deserved greater authority within the church as well. By the end of the 4th century, the Bishop of Arles had begun claiming that his city, rather than Vienne, should serve as the metropolitan centre of the region. A metropolitan bishop held important privileges. He possessed the authority to ordain bishops in neighbouring dioceses and to convene councils of the provincial clergy. Disputes over these rights soon emerged between the rival cities. A council of bishops gathered in northern Italy in an attempt to settle the conflict. The solution they proposed attempted to satisfy both sides. Authority would be divided between Arles and Vienne, each exercising metropolitan influence over nearby territories. Yet the decision left many details unclear and disagreements soon resurfaced. As the political importance of Arles continued to grow, so did the ambitions of its bishops. The city increasingly became a centre of administration within the Western Empire. High imperial officials resided there, and important governmental institutions were transferred to the city. This enhanced civil status encouraged church leaders in Arles to pursue greater ecclesiastical prominence. At the beginning of the 5th century, one bishop in particular sought to advance these ambitions. With strong political support, he secured from the Bishop of Rome an extraordinary grant of authority over several regions of southern Gaul. For a brief period, the Bishop of Arles possessed wide influence extending far beyond his own diocese. Yet this decision angered other bishops whose traditional rights were threatened. Opposition quickly spread across Gaul, and within a few years many of these privileges were withdrawn. Even after losing formal Roman support, later, bishops of Arles continued pursuing the same goal. Through alliances with other church leaders and by controlling episcopal appointments in surrounding territories, they attempted to strengthen their influence. These efforts eventually brought them into conflict with powerful figures in Rome, who feared the emergence of an overly independent church leader. In Gaul, the struggle between local ambition and papal authority would continue for decades. Meanwhile, the political world around Arles was changing rapidly. Roman control over southern Gaul weakened as new Germanic kingdoms expanded across the region. The Visigoths and Burgundians gradually took control of large territories that had once been firmly under imperial rule. As these new powers established themselves, ecclesiastical boundaries and authority began to follow political realities, rather than older Roman administrative divisions. Arles itself eventually passed permanently into Visigothic hands in the late 5th century. Although the city had once been one of the principal administrative centres of Roman Gaul, it did not become the capital of the Visigothic kingdom. The royal court remained farther west. Nevertheless, the city retained great importance as a regional centre. Under Visigothic rule, the administration of Arles changed surprisingly little. A royal representative governed military and judicial matters on behalf of the king. Yet much of the day-to-day management of the city remained in the hands of local elites and the bishop. Municipal officials continued collecting taxes, maintaining roads, and supervising public order. The bishop continued directing the affairs of the church. Religious tensions occasionally surfaced because the Visigothic rulers followed a different form of Christianity than the Roman population. Even so, evidence suggests that systematic persecution was rare. The more serious challenge for the Bishop of Arles was political rather than religious. Territories once under his influence were divided between different kingdoms, making it difficult to maintain authority across the entire region. When Caesarius first arrived in Arles, he quickly entered the social circles that shaped the life of the city. Arles was not only an important religious centre, but also a place where political influence, aristocratic families, and church leadership were closely connected. Among the people he met there, the most significant was Bishop Ionius. Ionius was both a leading figure of the local church and a relative of Caesarius. Later, biographies describe their first meeting as if the two men were unaware of their family connection, presenting the encounter almost as a dramatic coincidence. Yet this version of events was likely shaped by later storytellers. In reality, it is difficult to imagine that neither of them knew of the relationship beforehand. The narrative probably served another purpose. By presenting the meeting as unexpected, the writers avoided giving the impression that Caesarius had come to Arles in order to advance his career through family ties. At the same time, they could portray him as a monk who remained detached from worldly ambitions even after returning to urban life. The same narrative pattern appears throughout descriptions of Caesarius's early years in Arles. His biographers repeatedly emphasize that, although he now lived in the city, he remained deeply committed to the ascetic discipline he had learned in the monastery of Lerins. In their account, his character did not change when he left monastic life. Instead, he carried the ideals of the monastery with him into the centre of one of the most important cities of southern Gaul. Through Ionius and other connections, Caesarius soon became acquainted with members of the local aristocracy. Two figures appear especially prominently in the sources. One was a nobleman named Firminus, a man of high rank, whose influence extended across elite circles in Gaul. The other was a noblewoman named Gregoria, probably closely related to him and possibly his wife. Although little is known about Gregoria herself, Firminus was clearly an important figure within aristocratic society. He maintained correspondence with some of the most prominent intellectuals of the time and belonged to a network of educated nobles who valued literature, learning, and political influence. Firminus had connections with several well-known writers and churchmen. He exchanged letters with the celebrated aristocrat Sidonius Apollinaris, and was also linked through friendship and family connections with other influential figures of late Roman society. Through these relationships, he stood at the centre of an intellectual and political circle that shaped much of the cultural life of southern Gaul. It was likely through Firminus and Gregoria that Caesarius gained access to these circles. Their support would later prove valuable as his career advanced. Firminus himself was known as a man with strong literary interests. Writers dedicated works to him and addressed letters to him with respect. Because of his connections to scholars and teachers, he was in a position to introduce Caesarius to one of the most important intellectual influences in his life, a learned teacher named Julianus Pomerius. Pomerius had originally gained a reputation in North Africa. His reputation as a teacher and writer had been established there before political upheaval forced him to leave the region. The rise of new powers in Africa made life increasingly difficult for many Christian intellectuals, and Papmarius eventually relocated to Gaul. When he arrived in Arles, he decided to remain there, even though other bishops attempted to attract him to their own cities. In Arles, he eventually entered the clergy and became a priest. His life was marked not only by learning, but also by a strong commitment to spiritual discipline. Contemporary descriptions portray him as a man devoted to a demanding religious path, someone who combined intellectual training with ascetic dedication. His reputation rested both on his teaching and on the example of his personal life. Papmarius wrote several works, though only one survives completely today. His most important surviving text explored the nature of the Christian contemplative life and the responsibilities of church leaders. Other works attributed to him dealt with spiritual discipline, moral conduct, and the fleeting nature of worldly things. These writings show that Papmarius was deeply interested in the moral and spiritual reform of the Christian community, especially the clergy. The surviving biographies say little about the exact relationship between Papmarius and Caesarius, but they do preserve one memorable story meant to illustrate the young monk's attitude toward learning. According to the account, Papmarius attempted to train Caesarius in the refined techniques of classical rhetoric. Such training was common among educated elites, since the ability to speak elegantly and persuasively was considered an essential mark of leadership in late Roman society. One night, after spending long hours awake in prayer, Caesarius fell asleep with a book placed beneath his arm. In his sleep, he experienced a vivid dream. In the vision, he saw a serpent winding itself around his arm and shoulder and beginning to gnaw at the part of his body resting on the book. The image frightened him deeply. When he awoke, he interpreted the dream as a warning. He concluded that the pursuit of worldly eloquence could distract a Christian from the true path of spiritual wisdom. After this experience, he resolved to abandon such studies and to focus instead on the simplicity and purity of religious life. The story clearly echoes earlier accounts of similar dreams experienced by famous Christian figures. Such stories were commonly used to express an ideal rather than to describe an exact historical event. In this case, the dream was meant to highlight the belief that spiritual wisdom mattered more than rhetorical skill. It wasn't necessarily meant to suggest that Caesarius rejected learning altogether. In reality, he later demonstrated considerable ability as a preacher and writer. The story instead reflects a wider debate taking place in Gaul during the 5th century about the proper character of Christian leadership. At that time, many church leaders struggled to define how bishops and clergy should live. Some continued to behave much like members of the traditional aristocracy, maintaining wealth, estates, and the habits of elite society. Others believed that Christian leaders should adopt a more austere lifestyle, modelled on monastic ideals. This debate involved questions about authority, wealth, education, and the way clergy should communicate with ordinary believers. Papmarius played an important role in shaping these discussions. In his writings, he proposed a vision of church leadership that drew inspiration from earlier Christian thinkers. According to his view, bishops and clergy should move away from aristocratic luxury and instead adopt a way of life closer to that of monks. Their authority should come not from wealth or social status, but from moral discipline and spiritual commitment. In this model, the ideal bishop was expected to combine contemplation with active service. He should devote himself to prayer, study of scripture, and constant attention to spiritual matters. At the same time, he must care for the needs of his community. Feeding the hungry, clothing the poor, and rescuing those in danger were considered essential responsibilities of Christian leadership. Spiritual devotion and practical charity were meant to form a single unified way of life. This idea represented a significant shift in expectations for the clergy. Traditionally, many bishops in Gaul came from aristocratic families and continued to live in a manner similar to other nobles. Papal challenged this pattern. He argued that church leaders should renounce personal wealth and adopt a more disciplined life shared with fellow clergy. Instead of maintaining private estates and luxurious households, they should live communally and devote their resources to the needs of the poor. Such proposals form part of a broader movement calling for reform within the Church. Several writers of the 5th century criticize bishops who behaved more like powerful landowners than spiritual guides. They accused some church leaders of neglecting their congregations, pursuing wealth, and allowing injustice to flourish within their communities. These criticisms were often voiced by priests and monks who believed that the Church had drifted away from its original ideals. Different groups offered different solutions to this problem. Some argued that bishops should be chosen only from experienced clergy who had already served as priests or deacons. Others believed that monks, with their reputation for discipline and spiritual authority, made the best candidates. Still others continued to favour aristocrats, arguing that their education and influence made them effective leaders. Papal proposed a more demanding standard. In his view, the ideal bishop combined elements from each of these models but surpassed them all through personal sacrifice. A bishop should not rely on noble birth or inherited wealth. Instead, he should renounce personal possessions and devote himself entirely to the service of the Church. His authority would then rest on moral example rather than social status. Alongside this call for moral reform, Papal also addressed the question of preaching. In late Roman society, the ability to speak in elaborate and sophisticated language served as a sign of aristocratic education. Many bishops continued to preach in this elevated style, which reinforced their social prestige but could be difficult for ordinary people to understand. Papal argued for a different approach. In his view, sermons should be delivered in clear and accessible language so that everyone in the congregation could understand the message. The bishop's authority should not depend on elegant rhetoric, but on the sincerity of his words and the example of his life. Clear speech, moral integrity, and practical care for the community were the qualities that defined true Christian leadership. These ideas had a powerful influence on Caesarius. The young monk who had arrived in Arles seeking spiritual discipline soon found himself surrounded by debates about the future of the Church. Through figures such as Papal, he encountered a vision of reform that would shape his own career. Later in life, many of the reforms he introduced as bishop would closely resemble the principles advocated by his teacher. Meanwhile, Caesarius's position within the Church of Arles continued to develop. Bishop Aeonius soon began to see him as a possible successor. The young cleric possessed several qualities that made him an attractive candidate. He was ambitious and energetic, but he also had a strong reputation for ascetic discipline. His education and connections further strengthened his standing. Aeonius therefore arranged for him to enter the clergy of Arles. Caesarius was first ordained as a deacon and later as a priest. These positions allowed him to gain experience in church leadership and pastoral care. They also placed him in a position where he could demonstrate his abilities to the wider community. A few years later, an opportunity arose that further advanced his career. The abbot of the main monastery for men in Arles died near the end of the 5th century. Aeonius appointed Caesarius as his successor. The appointment allowed him to strengthen his reputation as a spiritual leader and administrator. Although little is known about his brief period as abbot, it appears that the monastery continued to flourish under his direction. Later, sources remembered that he organised its daily discipline so effectively that the community remained stable long after his leadership ended. The experience also prepared him for the larger responsibilities he would soon face. Before his death, Ionius took one final step to secure the future leadership of the church in Arles. He publicly recommended that Caesarius be chosen as his successor. Messages were sent to the clergy, the citizens of the city, and the authorities who governed the region. Aeonius expressed his desire that when his own life ended, no one else should be chosen to replace him. Several motives may have guided this decision. Aeonius may have believed that Caesarius would continue the policies he had established. He may also have hoped that his relative would strengthen the discipline of the local church. The possibility that Caesarius would pursue reforms may have played an important role in his choice. Despite these preparations, the transition did not proceed smoothly. The process of choosing a new bishop normally involved the participation of clergy, local elites, and the wider population. When a bishop attempted to designate his successor in advance, it often created tension and opposition. Other candidates might feel excluded, and some members of the community could resent the appearance of favoritism. In Caesarius's case, there were several reasons why opposition might arise. He had only recently arrived in Arles and had advanced rapidly through the ranks of the clergy. Other priests who had served the church for longer periods might have believed that they deserved the position. The fact that he was closely related to Aeonius could also raise suspicions of favoritism. Furthermore, if Caesarius was already associated with a program of reform, not everyone would have welcomed his leadership. Some clergy may have preferred the more traditional lifestyle that allowed them to maintain wealth and independence. Reform often required stricter discipline and greater personal sacrifice. Political considerations also played a role. Arles was under the rule of the Visigoths, and their approval could influence the outcome of episcopal elections. Securing their support would greatly strengthen any candidate's chances of success. For these reasons, the period between Aeonius's death and Caesarius's consecration may have been marked by conflict and negotiation. The available evidence suggests that the election was not immediate and may have involved competing factions within the city. In late antiquity, a bishop who came to power amid local opposition rarely enjoyed a peaceful beginning to his leadership. The early years of his episcopacy were often spent repairing divisions within the community and restoring unity among groups that had fiercely contested the election. Cities could remain deeply fractured long after the vote itself was settled. Rival factions, personal loyalties, and political ambitions continued to shape urban life. In such circumstances, a newly elected bishop needed to demonstrate not only authority but also moral legitimacy. One effective way to accomplish this was by embodying the ideal of the good bishop. A bishop who lived visibly as a holy man could rise above political quarrels and earn the respect of both supporters and critics. Public expectations also demanded more than spiritual devotion. Bishops were expected to care for the welfare of their congregations, support the poor, defend their cities during times of danger, and fulfill a wide range of responsibilities inherited from Roman traditions of civic patronage. Religious leadership and public service were closely connected. Examples from the same period show how newly elected bishops approached this challenge. One bishop who assumed office in a city still divided by conflict made reconciliation his immediate priority. He worked to rebuild harmony among those who had argued bitterly over the choice of bishop. Another bishop, who had also been elected amid controversy, quickly set out to demonstrate justice and generosity. He gave alms to the poor, helped widows and orphans, and presented himself as a protector of the vulnerable. By acting in this way, bishops reassured their communities that their authority would be exercised for the common good. Caesarius followed a similar path when he began his own episcopal career. One of his first goals was to convince the people of Arles that becoming a bishop had not changed his essential character. Before his election, he had lived as a monk, devoted to ascetic discipline and spiritual reflection. After his consecration, he continued to cultivate that same reputation. His lifestyle remained deliberately simple. His meals were modest, his clothing plain, and his daily routine filled with prayer and reading of sacred texts. At the same time, he carefully focused on those episcopal responsibilities that could be presented as extensions of monastic values. Preaching to the people, caring for the sick, assisting prisoners and the poor, these were duties that matched the ideals of humility and charity associated with the monastic life. By emphasizing these activities, Caesarius reinforced the image of a bishop who had not abandoned the discipline of the monastery. He also distanced himself from the management of the church's property. The Church of Arles possessed extensive lands and resources which could easily become a source of political suspicion. Instead of overseeing these estates personally, Caesarius assigned their administration to trusted subordinates. In doing so, he followed an example set by earlier church leaders who believed that bishops should avoid direct involvement in financial management whenever possible. Perhaps the most striking feature of his public image was his commitment to voluntary poverty. Influential Christian thinkers had argued that bishops should renounce personal wealth and live in simplicity. Caesarius attempted to follow this ideal as closely as possible. He did not abandon every personal possession, and his will later mentioned a few items that he left behind. Yet compared with many other bishops of his time, his material resources were extremely limited. The difference becomes clear when his possessions are compared with those of another bishop, who was widely praised for his spiritual discipline. That bishop's estate included numerous properties, dozens of dependents and slaves, large sums of money, livestock, silver vessels, and valuable clothing. By contrast, the belongings listed in Caesarius's will were modest. They included 2 household slaves and a small collection of garments, ceremonial vestments, a tunic, a belt, and several woolen cloaks. In a society where bishops often came from wealthy aristocratic backgrounds, such simplicity stood out. It reinforced his reputation as a man who valued spiritual commitment over material wealth. Yet the asceticism practiced by Caesarius as bishop differed from the asceticism he had followed earlier as a monk. In the monastery, self-discipline had been a personal path toward spiritual perfection. As bishop, however, his austere lifestyle served a broader purpose. It was meant to influence the clergy and the wider community. By presenting himself as a model of humility and restraint, he hoped to strengthen his moral authority and calm the tensions that had surrounded his election. Ascetic reputation also carried another advantage. A bishop known for living simply was expected to be generous toward others. In late Roman society, generosity toward the poor was an essential part of public leadership. A leader who consumed little for himself could give more to those in need. Caesarius embraced this expectation by distributing aid to the poor and assisting captives who required ransom. He also established a place near the cathedral where the sick could receive care while listening to the daily prayers of the church. This initiative reflected the growing Christian practice of combining charitable service with religious devotion. Those who were ill or vulnerable could be supported physically, while also sharing in the spiritual life of the community. Around the same time, Caesarius may have secured an important privilege from the Visigothic king Alaric. Church lands in Arles were granted exemption from certain taxes. This decision increased the financial resources available to the local church. The additional wealth could be used to support clergy, maintain buildings, and provide assistance to the poor. Such measures strengthened the position of the church, while also increasing the bishop's popularity among both clergy and laypeople. Alongside these acts of charity and humility, Caesarius also began introducing reforms influenced by earlier Christian thinkers. These reforms were not simply responses to political circumstances. They reflected his understanding of what it meant to be a bishop. For Caesarius, the central responsibility of a bishop was the spiritual welfare of the people entrusted to his care. The bishop had to guide the community toward a life worthy of the Christian faith. This idea was not unique to him, but he pursued it with exceptional energy. He believed that the spiritual practices developed in monasteries offered the best path toward a deeper Christian life, even for ordinary believers who lived outside monastic communities. One of his earliest reforms, therefore, focused on the clergy attached to the Cathedral of Arles. Caesarius organized a portion of them into a community that resembled a monastery. Such arrangements were uncommon but not entirely new. In earlier generations, some bishops had encouraged clergy to live together under a shared discipline similar to that of monks. Within this community, the clergy adopted a simple communal lifestyle under the bishop's supervision. They lived in the bishop's residence and shared their meals together. Women were permanently excluded from this household in order to maintain strict discipline. Their meals were modest, and even the tableware reflected simplicity. During these gatherings, they listened to readings from scripture and other religious works, discussing their meaning with Caesarius. Their daily routine included communal prayer as well. During the night, they rose to chant psalms, following patterns of worship that had long been practiced in monastic communities. Through these practices, the cathedral clergy lived, not merely as administrators of religious services, but as a spiritual brotherhood shaped by discipline and prayer. Several goals lay behind this arrangement. By forming the clergy into a disciplined community, Caesarius strengthened his authority over them. Monastic rules emphasized obedience, and this structure helped ensure unity among the clergy. At the same time, living together allowed them to receive systematic religious instruction. Previously, such training had been largely limited to monks in places like the island monastery of Lerins. Another important purpose was symbolic. The lifestyle of these clergy could serve as an example for the broader Christian population. Their commitment to prayer, discipline, and simplicity illustrated the ideal of a life devoted to God. Even people who lived ordinary lives in the city could see this example and aspire to imitate it in their own way. To make this influence more effective, Caesarius arranged for certain daily prayers to be celebrated in the cathedral itself, rather than privately within the bishop's residence. By holding these services publicly, he allowed ordinary believers to participate more fully in the spiritual rhythm of monastic prayer. These services added new moments of worship to the daily life of the city. When combined with the prayers already held in the morning and evening, the cycle of worship became more visible and accessible to the population. Caesarius believed that such practices could nurture deeper faith among ordinary Christians. He also encouraged the people to learn hymns and psalms. During worship, they were expected to sing in alternating voices, following patterns used by clergy. Some sang in Greek, others in Latin, reflecting the diverse traditions of the region. In this way, participation in worship became a shared experience, rather than a performance reserved only for trained clerics. Preaching played a central role in his pastoral strategy. Caesarius addressed his congregation with a mixture of gentleness and severity. At times, he used encouraging language to attract listeners. At other times, he spoke sharply, warning them of the dangers of moral failure. Some people responded best to kindness, while others required stern reminders of divine judgment. Through both approaches, he sought to guide his audience toward a more disciplined Christian life. These efforts were intended not only to promote spiritual growth, but also to restore unity in a city that had recently experienced political conflict. By strengthening the moral authority of the Church and shaping the behaviour of clergy and lay people alike, Caesarius hoped to stabilise the community and reinforce his own leadership. After the siege of Arles and the political struggles that followed, another dramatic episode began to shape the reputation of Bishop Caesarius. During this tense period, he was briefly imprisoned by the Gothic authorities, and historians have long debated why this happened. One explanation links his arrest to accusations of treason involving the Jewish community of the city. According to this interpretation, a forged letter may have circulated among the Catholic population of Arles. The document supposedly accused the Jewish minority of cooperating with enemies of the city. If this theory is correct, the purpose of the forgery was not to communicate with the Goths themselves, but to influence the local Christian population. By stirring anger against the Jews, supporters of Caesarius may have hoped to redirect public attention away from the accusations that had recently damaged the bishop's reputation. In a city already shaken by siege and political tension, such rumours could easily provoke strong reactions. If large numbers of Christian citizens began to protest or publicly support Caesarius, the Gothic authorities would have faced a difficult situation. The defence of Arles depended heavily on the manpower of the local population. Even if Gothic officials suspected that the bishop had acted improperly, they could not risk alienating the majority of the city's inhabitants at a time when loyalty and cooperation were essential. The Jewish community, although established and influential, represented only a small minority. Under such pressure, the Gothic rulers eventually released Caesarius from captivity. His authority had been shaken, but he remained Bishop of Arles and was soon able to continue his work during a period of major political change in southern Gaul. That change arrived when the Ostrogoths took control of Provence. The shift in power created a new political environment that would shape the later years of Caesarius's career. The transition began during the long conflict that followed the Frankish and Burgundian invasion of the region. For most of the year 508, the city of Arles endured a severe siege. Supplies ran low, the surrounding countryside was devastated, and the population faced constant uncertainty. Eventually, the Ostrogothic king sent military forces to break the blockade and relieve the city. The Gothic army advanced toward Arles and confronted the besieging forces of the Franks and Burgundians in a major battle. Contemporary accounts later claimed that enormous numbers of Frankish soldiers were killed in the fighting. Although such figures were probably exaggerated, the outcome of the battle was clear. The attacking armies were defeated, and the siege of Arles was lifted before the end of the year. With the immediate threat removed, the Gothic troops continued their campaigns against the Burgundians in other parts of the region. Over the following year, Gothic forces pushed their enemies back across the Rhone Valley and forced them to retreat toward the Durance River. With these victories secured, the Ostrogothic king reorganized the newly conquered territory. The lands east of the Rhone and south of the Durance were incorporated into a restored administrative district that resembled the old Roman prefecture of Gaul. This decision carried symbolic importance as well as practical value. By reviving an ancient Roman institution, the new rulers signalled their intention to present themselves not as destroyers of Roman order, but as its guardians and restorers. A respected Roman official named Liberius was appointed to oversee the region. He had previously served in high administrative positions in Italy and was known for his experience and loyalty. Under the new arrangement, Arles once again became the administrative centre of the region. Yet the structure of government differed from that of earlier Roman times. Because the territory was relatively small, there was no need to establish the full hierarchy of provincial governors. Instead, Gothic officials known as counts were placed in charge of individual cities or small groups of cities. Despite the new political framework, much of everyday administration remained similar to what had existed before. Local institutions continued to function, and the internal life of cities like Arles changed little at first. Gothic soldiers were stationed in key urban centres and rural fortifications, ensuring military control and stability. Defensive positions were established along the Durance River to guard against renewed attacks from the Burgundians, whose rulers had begun pursuing alliances with the Eastern Roman Empire. On the southern frontier, however, fortifications were considered unnecessary. In the year 511, the Ostrogothic king assumed control over the Visigothic kingdom as well, acting as regent for his young grandson. With both realms under the same authority, the border between them no longer required military defences. One rival claimant to the Visigothic throne was eventually eliminated, and the political landscape of the region became more stable. During this period of consolidation, the Gothic administration maintained control over Provence for several decades. The relative peace that followed created favourable conditions for the Church in Arles and allowed Caesarius to pursue many of his most important projects. His influence grew steadily during these years, thanks both to his personal abilities and to the political climate created by the new rulers. Among his most notable achievements were the reorganisation of religious life in the city and the strengthening of institutions that would shape the spiritual life of the region. One of his major accomplishments was the permanent re-establishment of a monastery for women, which became a centre of prayer and religious discipline. He also played a leading role in several church councils held in southern Gaul. These gatherings addressed theological questions, church discipline, and the organisation of Christian life in the region. The years following the Gothic victory were therefore a turning point. The city that had recently endured siege and devastation gradually began to recover under a more stable political order. Within this environment, Caesarius was able to expand his pastoral work and promote reforms that would influence Christian communities far beyond Arles. His activities as a protector of captives, a patron of monastic life, and a leading voice in regional church councils strengthened both his reputation and the position of the Church during a period of profound transformation in the Western Mediterranean world. Caesarius likely arrived at the court of the Ostrogothic king sometime in the spring or summer of the year 513. He did not travel alone. Among those accompanying him was a notary named Messianus, whose account of the journey later became part of the narrative describing these events. According to this report, the bishop's arrival made a remarkable impression on the royal court. When Caesarius entered the palace, he was led before the king to offer his greeting. The moment was described as striking. The ruler, seeing the calm and confident presence of the visiting bishop, reportedly rose from his seat to welcome him. After removing the royal insignia from his head, he greeted Caesarius warmly and began speaking with him in a respectful tone. The king first asked about the difficulties of the long journey from Gaul to Italy. He then inquired about the situation in Arles and about the Gothic soldiers stationed there. Once the meeting ended and the bishop had departed, the king turned to those gathered around him and expressed strong disapproval toward those who had accused Caesarius. According to the report preserved by Messianus, the king declared that it was unjust to force an innocent and holy man to travel such a long distance under suspicion. He explained that the bishop's presence had left a deep impression on him. When Caesarius entered the room, the king said he had felt a sense of awe and reverence. To him, the bishop appeared not as a criminal, but as a man of extraordinary character and integrity. For that reason, he refused to believe the accusations that had been brought against him. Even with this dramatic description, it remains difficult to determine exactly how Caesarius managed to clear his name before the Gothic ruler. A letter written shortly afterward by the influential churchman Ennodius provides additional clues. In this message of congratulations, Ennodius praised the bishop for his success and attributed the outcome to divine protection as well as to the respect the king felt for Caesarius' way of life. According to the letter, the ruler had been impressed by the bishop's humility, his devotion to monastic discipline, his learning, and the example he set for others. The correspondence also hints that Caesarius had powerful supporters working quietly on his behalf. His connections with respected church leaders in Italy may have helped persuade the court that the accusations against him were unjust. At the same time, Caesarius himself likely presented a defense centered on the moral motivations behind his controversial actions. He couldn't deny that he had sold church treasures to ransom prisoners, or that he had transferred certain church lands to support a monastery. Instead, he argued that these actions had been carried out for noble and compassionate purposes. The redemption of captives and the protection of religious communities, he maintained, were expressions of Christian duty rather than abuses of authority. Several factors may have influenced the king's decision to release him. The defense offered by Caesarius presented his actions as acts of charity rather than wrongdoing. The support he received from respected figures in Italy added credibility to his case. In addition, the Gothic ruler had practical reasons to maintain the loyalty of the Roman population in Provence. By showing respect toward a widely admired bishop, the king could strengthen ties with the local community and reinforce political stability in a recently contested region. The final decision was clear. Caesarius was released from custody and allowed to continue his work. The king even demonstrated his goodwill through a generous gift. A large silver bowl weighing many pounds was sent to the inn where the bishop was staying, along with a substantial sum of gold coins. The message accompanying the gift asked Caesarius to accept the vessel in memory of the king. Yet the bishop responded in a way that surprised the royal court. Rather than keeping the gift as a symbol of royal favour, he sold the silver bowl and used the money to ransom prisoners who had been captured during recent wars. Instead of provoking anger, this unexpected act appears to have strengthened the king's admiration for him. The ruler accepted the decision and allowed the money to be used for charity, suggesting that he truly believed Caesarius acted from sincere motives. The bishop's reputation continued to grow while he remained in Italy. Members of the court and prominent aristocrats began offering gifts of their own, hoping that he would distribute the money to the needy. Such acts of generosity served several purposes at once. Donors believed that supporting charitable work would earn them spiritual merit. At the same time, public generosity enhanced their social prestige in an environment where displays of patronage carried great importance. For Caesarius, these donations provided the resources needed to continue his work of freeing prisoners captured during the conflicts in southern Gaul. Many of these captives came from towns that had suffered devastating losses during the war. One city in particular had been almost entirely emptied of its population through enslavement. With the funds he received, Caesarius was able to ransom many of these people and arrange for their return home. Once they were freed, he supplied them with food, transportation, and other necessities so they could safely make the journey back to their communities. Stories about the bishop's character and actions soon spread beyond the court. Reports circulated that he possessed not only generosity but also spiritual power. Such accounts resembled earlier traditions describing holy men who were believed to perform miracles. During his stay in Italy, Caesarius was said to have healed a young official who had been suffering from a serious illness. In another story, he was credited with freeing a household from strange disturbances that were interpreted as the work of hostile spiritual forces. These accounts, whether literal or symbolic, helped reinforce the image of Caesarius as a man of exceptional holiness. News of his reputation eventually reached the city of Rome itself. According to later narratives, the leading figures of the city, including church officials and members of the Roman elite, became eager to meet him. Caesarius also had important reasons of his own to visit the ancient capital. While in Italy, he needed to resolve several practical issues with the Bishop of Rome. One of the most pressing concerns involved the legal protection of the monastery he had founded in Arles. The controversy surrounding the use of church property had already caused serious problems, and Caesarius hoped to secure arrangements that would prevent similar accusations in the future. He likely arrived in Rome during the early autumn of the year 513. The city had long served as a centre of authority for bishops seeking assistance in disputes or political struggles within their own regions. For centuries, church leaders from distant provinces had appealed to Rome when they needed support in conflicts with rival bishops, or when they wished to strengthen their authority. In return, the Bishop of Rome expected recognition of his position as a leading figure in the Christian world. Caesarius followed this well-established pattern. He brought with him a written petition outlining several questions of church discipline and law. One of his most urgent concerns involved the rules governing church property. He asked the Roman bishop to confirm that church lands should generally not be sold, but also requested permission for exceptions, when the property would benefit religious communities such as monasteries. Such approval would allow him to defend the support he had given to his own monastery. He also asked for confirmation of several disciplinary rules. One issue involved the ordination of men who had recently held public office. Caesarius believed that such individuals should spend a significant period living a disciplined religious life before entering the clergy. Another request concerned women who had dedicated themselves to religious life as widows or nuns. He wanted stronger protection to prevent them from being forced into marriage after making their vows. Finally, he asked for renewed condemnation of the practice of buying or selling church offices. The Roman bishop responded to these requests with careful consideration. Most of Caesarius's proposals were accepted without hesitation. The Pope agreed with the need to prevent the sale of church positions and supported stronger protections for women who had taken religious vows. He also endorsed stricter rules regarding the ordination of former officials. However, the question of church property proved more complicated. The Bishop of Rome confirmed that church lands should not be freely sold, but he refused to create a special exemption for monasteries. Instead, he allowed only temporary use of church property in certain situations. This meant that land could support religious communities, but ownership would ultimately remain with the church itself. Although the decision did not fully satisfy Caesarius, it reflected broader concerns within the Roman Church. Earlier disputes in Rome had already revolved around the misuse of church property. Because of these conflicts, strict laws had been established to protect ecclesiastical lands. The Pope, therefore, had little choice but to uphold these rules even when dealing with a respected ally. Despite this disagreement, the meeting between the two bishops produced another outcome that proved far more significant. Caesarius asked the Pope to confirm his authority as Metropolitan Bishop over a large part of southern Gaul. This position had long been contested by other powerful bishops in the region. By obtaining confirmation from Rome, Caesarius hoped to strengthen his claims and prevent rivals from challenging his authority. The Pope agreed and reaffirmed the jurisdiction of Arles over numerous dioceses. At the same time, he granted Caesarius an even greater distinction. The Bishop of Arles was appointed as the papal representative in Gaul. This role meant that he would act as a bridge between the churches of the region and the Roman See. As a symbol of this responsibility, Caesarius received a special vestment known as the pallium. This garment had long been associated with the authority of the Bishop of Rome. By granting it to Caesarius, the Pope was publicly acknowledging his position as a leading figure within the Church of Gaul. The responsibilities attached to this office were significant. Caesarius was expected to oversee church matters across a broad region, convene annual councils when necessary, and report important developments to Rome. He would also ensure that communications between Gaul and the Roman Church remained reliable. For Rome, the arrangement offered an effective way to maintain influence in territories governed by powerful Germanic kingdoms. Direct control was impossible, but a trusted bishop could represent Roman interests. For Caesarius, the appointment brought prestige and strengthened his authority among other bishops. In the year 529, an important gathering of church leaders took place in the city of Orange in southern Gaul. The meeting was organised to celebrate the dedication of a new basilica that had been donated to the city by Liberius, one of the most powerful officials governing the region on behalf of the Ostrogothic kingdom. The event was not only a religious ceremony, but also a moment of political importance. 14 bishops from the Provence under the leadership of Caesarius of Arles attended the council. Alongside them stood 8 members of the regional aristocracy. Their presence showed clearly that the Bishop of Arles enjoyed the support of influential political and social figures who were willing to stand beside him in resolving disputes within the church. Among the prominent laymen present was Liberius himself, the highest Ostrogothic authority in Provence. Another participant was Nematius, who would later serve as governor of the region under Frankish rule before eventually becoming Bishop of Vienne. Pantagatus was also present, a man who would later hold the same episcopal office in that city. Several other aristocrats joined them as well, including Caesarius, Cariatho, Opilio, Marcellus, and Deodatus. Although less is known about these men, their participation demonstrates the broad support that Caesarius had gathered among both church leaders and the ruling elite of the region. On the 3rd day of July in that year, the bishops and aristocrats formally approved the decisions of the council. The final document contained a short introduction, a series of 25 church laws, and a concluding declaration explaining the council's understanding of Christian belief. Many of the rules closely followed theological guidance that Caesarius had earlier received from Rome. Yet the opening introduction and the final statement of faith appear to have been written locally, most likely by Caesarius himself. Together, these texts attempted to establish a balanced theological position that could settle ongoing disagreements about grace, faith, and salvation. At the time, church leaders across Gaul were divided over how strongly they should follow the teachings of Augustine on divine grace. Some thinkers had argued that God predestined certain people for salvation and others for damnation long before they acted in the world. Other theologians rejected this view, insisting that human beings still possessed meaningful freedom and responsibility. The Council at Orange attempted to steer a middle course between these positions. It rejected the idea that anyone was predestined to evil, and it also avoided declaring that salvation was predetermined in a rigid or unavoidable way. At the same time, the Council insisted firmly that faith and good actions were only possible through the assistance of divine grace. This compromise reflected the intellectual background of Caesarius himself. Earlier in his life, he had been influenced by monastic teachers who emphasized human effort, discipline, and moral struggle. Later, he also came to appreciate the powerful ideas of Augustine about the necessity of God's grace in every stage of the spiritual life. The decisions at Orange, therefore, combined elements of both traditions. They presented a vision of Christianity in which divine grace came first, awakening faith within a person. Yet human beings were still called to cooperate actively with that grace through their choices and actions. The Council expressed this idea in a reassuring way. It taught that all baptized believers could achieve salvation if they faithfully worked toward it, with the help of Christ. Grace did not remove human effort. Instead, it made that effort possible. According to this teaching, Christians were not trapped in a predetermined destiny. They were called to live actively and responsibly, performing good works, practicing charity, and following the moral teachings of the Church. In the sermons delivered to ordinary congregations, Caesarius often explained this message in a much simpler form. He taught that salvation was open to anyone who sincerely followed the practices recommended by the Church. Acts of mercy toward the poor, forgiveness of enemies, and generosity toward those in need were repeatedly presented as essential paths toward eternal reward. In this practical interpretation, Christian life was described less as a complex theological mystery and more as a daily commitment to compassion, charity, and moral discipline. One sermon illustrates this approach clearly. Speaking about charity, Caesarius encouraged believers to reflect deeply on the healing power of generosity. Giving food or clothing to the poor was not merely a good action. It was described as a spiritual medicine capable of cleansing sins and leading the soul toward eternal life. In another sermon, he turned to the words of Jesus about forgiveness. If believers forgave the wrongs done against them, he explained, God would also forgive them. The responsibility for judgment, in a sense, rested partly in the hands of each individual. Through these teachings, Caesarius shaped a moral vision that ordinary people could easily understand. Faith, forgiveness, generosity, and compassion became the central signs of a Christian life. In this way, theology was transformed into practical guidance for everyday behaviour. Only a few months after the council at Orange, another meeting took place in the city of Vaison. This gathering had a more pastoral focus and dealt mainly with church practices, rather than doctrinal disputes. Caesarius and 11 bishops from neighbouring dioceses met to discuss several reforms intended to strengthen religious life throughout Provence. 3 of the decisions concerned the structure of the liturgy. The bishops agreed that the prayer known as Kyrie eleison should be recited regularly during morning and evening services as well as during the Mass. They also decided that the hymn Sanctus should be sung during every celebration of the Eucharist. Another change involved adding a phrase to the doxology, Gloria Patri, emphasizing that God's glory existed from the beginning and continues forever. In addition, the name of the Bishop of Rome was to be included in certain liturgical prayers, reinforcing the symbolic connection between the churches of Gaul and the wider Christian world. The remaining reforms addressed church leadership and education. Parish priests were instructed to train young readers in their own homes so that future clergy could learn scripture and liturgy from an early age. Even more controversial was the decision allowing priests and deacons to preach sermons. Traditionally, the act of preaching had been closely guarded by bishops, who regarded it as one of the central expressions of their authority. By extending this responsibility to lower clergy, the council introduced a significant shift in church practice. Not all bishops welcomed these reforms. Some feared that allowing priests and deacons to preach might weaken the authority of bishops within their dioceses. Several leading bishops who had previously supported Caesarius chose not to sign the final decisions of the council. Some were absent from the meeting, while others declined to add their names to the document. Their silence signalled disagreement without directly blocking the reforms. Despite this resistance, the reforms went forward. The success of these councils reveals how much influence Caesarius had gained among church leaders in the region. A group of loyal bishops consistently supported his efforts to strengthen discipline and promote Christian teaching throughout southern Gaul. Among them, one of the most devoted was Cyprianus, Bishop of Toulon, who defended Caesarius's theological ideas and later wrote a biography describing his life. Several other bishops also supported his initiatives over many years, attending multiple councils and approving his reforms. Although little is known about their personal histories, their cooperation allowed Caesarius to introduce a series of changes intended to deepen Christian life across the region. Yet the greatest influence of Caesarius was not exercised through councils alone. His strongest authority was felt within his own city of Arles, where he could guide religious life directly through preaching, ritual leadership, and pastoral care. In that environment, he developed a powerful combination of spoken teaching and religious ceremony that shaped the beliefs and practices of the community. Understanding how this influence worked requires looking closely at the methods he used to communicate his message. Through sermons, public rituals, acts of healing, and dramatic displays of spiritual authority, Caesarius sought to shape the values of the people around him. These forms of communication created a powerful blend of words, symbols, and actions that define the religious life of the city and reinforce the authority of its bishop. Caesarius did not limit his influence to preaching alone. Words were powerful, but he believed that behavior inside the church carried just as much meaning. For that reason, he demanded that members of the congregation follow clear standards of respect when they gathered for worship. Clothing, posture, and physical gestures were not treated as small details. They were visible signs of reverence that reflected the inner attitude of a believer. People who entered the church were expected to dress properly and to behave in a way that showed humility and discipline. Gestures played a particularly important role. Caesarius insisted that worshippers kneel, bow their heads, or incline their bodies in signs of respect. Standing lazily or lying on the floor inside the church was strongly criticized. Such behavior, he warned, turned a sacred place into something ordinary. To him, physical posture revealed moral character. The way a person moved, bowed, or stood inside the church demonstrated whether that individual truly recognized the holiness of the place and the authority present within it. These gestures were not random habits. They formed part of a deeper cultural system in which respect and hierarchy were expressed through bodily behavior. In a society where rank and authority were clearly understood, people instinctively knew how to show deference towards someone powerful. Caesarius drew on that familiar social language when explaining how Christians should behave during worship. He often asked his listeners to imagine approaching a king or a high official with an important request. No one, he said, would dare to stand casually before such a person while demanding a favour. Instead, they would bow, kneel, or lower their heads in humility. In the same way, believers should approach God with visible respect. The society in which Caesarius lived accepted hierarchy as a normal and unquestioned reality. Relations between rulers and subjects, masters and servants, patrons and dependents were woven deeply into everyday life. Even acts of punishment reflected this structure. One account praises Caesarius for limiting the number of lashes that could be given to servants in a single day. Such details reveal how strongly the culture was shaped by ideas of authority and obedience. Because of this social background, religious relationships could easily be described using the same language. God was often imagined as a powerful ruler or generous patron. In sermons and teachings, the duties of Christians toward God were frequently compared to the obligations of servants, tenants, or subjects toward their earthly superiors. Loyalty, humility, and obedience were virtues expected both in society and in religion. This connection between earthly authority and divine authority also strengthened the role of the bishop. During the liturgy, the bishop stood at the center of the ceremony and represented Christ to the gathered community. When believers bowed, knelt, or showed reverence toward God, those gestures also affirmed the position of the bishop, who presided over the ritual. In practice, respect offered during worship could be understood in two ways at once: as devotion to God and as recognition of the bishop's authority. For this reason, participation in the liturgy was extremely important. Caesarius repeatedly urged Christians to attend Mass on Sundays and feast days without fail. Arriving late was discouraged, and leaving early was considered even worse. The entire ceremony, from beginning to end, was meant to be experienced together by the whole community. Even those who did not receive communion were expected to remain until the final blessing. Attendance carried a deeper meaning than simple religious duty. When people gathered in the church and remained together during the ceremony, they publicly affirmed the shared beliefs of the community. Their presence showed agreement with the authority of the bishop and acceptance of the religious values he taught. Leaving the assembly, on the other hand, could be interpreted as rejecting that authority. Because of this symbolic importance, the moment of the sermon held special weight. When listeners stayed in the church to hear the bishop speak, they acknowledged his right to guide the community's beliefs and moral standards. Walking out during the sermon was therefore more than an act of impatience. It could be seen as an open challenge to his authority. Stories about Caesarius describe how seriously he took this matter. On one occasion, after the reading of the Gospel, he noticed several people quietly leaving the church before the sermon began. Immediately, he descended from the altar and called out to them, urging them to remain and listen. He warned that ignoring the message meant neglecting the care of their own souls. After such incidents became frequent, he sometimes ordered the doors of the church to be closed after the Gospel reading. Those who had previously tried to slip away were then forced to stay until the sermon ended. The measure was strict, but it reflected his belief that participation in the ritual could eventually shape the attitudes of the people themselves. Preaching and ceremony were not the only tools through which Caesarius influenced his community. Religious leaders of his time believed that the personal life of a bishop also carried great authority. The character, habits, and appearance of a spiritual leader were expected to demonstrate the values he preached. In this way, moral example became another form of persuasion. Accounts of Caesarius emphasize how closely his behavior matched the ideals he promoted. His clothing was simple and rough, rather than luxurious. Observers often described his appearance as calm and radiant, suggesting an inner peace that showed itself outwardly. More important than his appearance, however, were his actions. He became widely known for generosity toward the poor, compassion for the sick, and concern for prisoners and travellers in need. These acts created a powerful image of a bishop whose life matched his teachings. Such behaviour built a reputation for holiness. In the religious culture of late antiquity, holy individuals were often believed to possess special spiritual power. A bishop who lived a life of humility, discipline, and charity could be seen as someone particularly close to God. People might then approach him not only for advice, but also for healing, protection, or help in moments of crisis. This idea had strong precedence in earlier Christian tradition. Stories about famous holy men described them performing cures, casting out evil spirits, or even controlling natural forces through prayer. These narratives shaped the expectations of ordinary believers. When a bishop displayed signs of holiness, people sometimes believed that similar powers might be present in him as well. The reputation of Caesarius developed in this way. According to later accounts, he was credited with numerous miracles during his lifetime. Some stories describe him healing illness, or freeing individuals from what were believed to be evil spirits. Others tell of prayers that halted disasters such as destructive fires. These reports circulated widely among the population, often spreading through word of mouth long before they were ever written down. News of such events travelled quickly. A healing that occurred in one city might soon be known throughout the surrounding region. Witnesses retold the story, and listeners passed it along again. In this way, the image of Caesarius as a man favoured by divine power gradually spread. Many of these miracle stories follow a similar pattern. Someone facing illness, misfortune, or possession by an evil spirit approached the bishop and asked for help. At first, he sometimes hesitated, unwilling to appear proud or eager to display extraordinary power. But after persuasion, he would agree to pray or perform a ritual action. Before acting, he often attempted to understand the nature of the problem. Questions were asked, symptoms were observed, and comparisons were made with other cases. This process resembled the careful examination performed by physicians. Once the situation was understood, he performed a simple ritual using methods accepted by the Church. These actions could include prayer, blessing with holy water, anointing with sacred oil, or making the sign of the cross. Such rituals usually took place in the presence of others. Family members, members of the congregation, or curious onlookers gathered around to witness the event. Their presence strengthened the belief that a miracle might occur. When the ritual ended, the bishop often left quietly, rather than waiting to see the results, attributing any success entirely to the power of God rather than his own ability. When a recovery followed, the story spread quickly through the community. Gratitude was expressed, and witnesses repeated the account to others. In this way, the event became part of the bishop's growing reputation for holiness. Not all miraculous stories involved the bishop acting directly. After his death, objects associated with him were also believed to possess healing power. Pieces of clothing, objects he had used, or items that had touched his body were treated as sacred relics. People carried these objects to the sick or placed them in houses threatened by disaster, hoping that divine help would follow. These relics were used in many different ways. Some were placed on the body of a sick person, others were dipped in water that was then drunk, and still others were fixed to walls or buried in the ground to protect buildings from harm. Those who possessed such objects believed that they carried a trace of the holy power associated with Caesarius. Stories describing these relics show how strongly belief shaped the events themselves. Healing was expected, and that expectation often became part of the experience. When a cure seemed to follow, it reinforced the conviction that divine power had been at work. Through such stories, the influence of Caesarius extended beyond formal worship and public preaching. His reputation, his actions, and the objects connected with his life all became part of a wider system of belief. In that system, religion was not confined to church ceremonies. It appeared in daily life, in moments of illness or danger, and in the hopes people placed in the power of faith. A way of life promoted by Caesarius presented Christianity as a complete system of beliefs, values, and daily practices. Over many centuries, Christian teachers and theologians had shaped this system from the scriptures, turning it into an organized religious structure. In this sense, Christianity differed greatly from older pagan traditions. which had usually grown naturally out of the customs of local communities. Christianity, however, also attempted to function as a religion of everyday life, responding to the expectations and traditions of the people who lived in each city. This created a natural tension. The ideals of Christian teaching did not always fit easily with the habits, beliefs, and social needs that had developed long before Christianity arrived. Because of this tension, devotion to the Christian lifestyle, encouraged by Caesarius, did not appear equally among all inhabitants of the city of Arles. At one end of the social and religious spectrum were those who rejected Christianity altogether or followed other faiths. Some residents remained loyal to older pagan practices. Others followed Judaism, and some groups held Christian beliefs that differed from the official teachings supported by the Church. At the opposite end were individuals who fully embraced the strict religious vision promoted by Caesarius. These were mainly clergy, monks, nuns, and lay people who chose an ascetic lifestyle. Between these two extremes stood the majority of the population. Many ordinary people accepted certain parts of Christian belief, while continuing to adapt the religion to their own family traditions and social customs. Some preserved elements of older religious practices that Christianity had not replaced, while others adopted only those aspects of Christian teaching that seemed practical or meaningful for daily life. This mixture of practices created a wide variety of religious expressions within the community. In reality, this diversity was the inevitable cost of building a religious system that claimed to represent the entire population of a city. To understand how Christianity functioned in this environment, it is necessary to look at the structure of the community itself. The city of Arles had always contained multiple social and cultural groups. By the early 6th century, its population remained remarkably diverse. Traders, travellers, and migrants had brought people from many regions of the Mediterranean world. Goths, Franks, Greeks, Syrians, Jews, and the local Gallo-Roman population all lived within the same urban space. Even the Gallo-Romans were not a single unified group, but a mixture of families with different histories and social backgrounds. Within Caesarius's congregation, the majority appear to have been Greeks and Gallo-Romans, and church services were conducted in both Latin and Greek. The professions represented in the city reflected its role as a centre of commerce. Merchants, shopkeepers, goldsmiths, craftsmen, doctors, and artisans formed part of the Christian population, along with farmers, soldiers, and people employed in various forms of government service. Despite these scattered references, very little is known about individual members of the Christian community. Only fragments of their lives survive in written records. A few prominent aristocrats appear in historical accounts, including wealthy landowners and officials who held high social rank. Other sources mention nobles, minor administrators, and ordinary free citizens who owned houses in the city. Some references even reveal the presence of enslaved individuals within ecclesiastical households. From the clergy themselves, only names and occasional stories remain. Priests, deacons, subdeacons, and church officials who assisted in the administration of the diocese. Tomb inscriptions provide another glimpse of the population, but they usually preserve nothing more than a name, an age, and a date of death. These small fragments give the impression of a large and complex community, whose full story can no longer be reconstructed. Even if the details of individual lives remain unclear, it is possible to observe how religious leaders attempted to shape the identity of the city as a Christian society. During the previous century, the growing influence of Christianity had already begun to transform the physical landscape of Arles. Churches, monasteries, and other religious buildings gradually reshaped the city's appearance. Under the leadership of Caesarius, this process continued. he founded a monastery for women and built a nearby church connected to it. This construction expanded the religious district in the southeastern part of the city. Yet the significance of this project went beyond architecture. By allowing nuns to be buried within the church inside the city walls, Caesarius deliberately challenged a long-standing Roman tradition that required burial outside the city. Such a decision symbolized a profound change in how the community understood itself. In Roman culture, burial beyond the walls had been a defining feature of urban identity. Bringing burials inside the city marked a shift toward a new religious vision of communal life. This innovation did not immediately replace older customs. Most people in Arles continued to bury their dead in traditional cemeteries outside the walls. New burial churches were also constructed in those areas, showing that earlier habits remained strong. Nevertheless, the decision to create a sacred burial space inside the city signaled a gradual transformation in how public space and religious identity were understood. Archaeological discoveries from the city provide further evidence of these changes. Excavations of the Roman circus revealed that parts of the massive structure had been converted into residential dwellings. Spaces that once supported the outer walls of the arena were enclosed and transformed into small apartments. Over time, these dwellings became increasingly crowded, as the original rooms were divided into smaller units. Hundreds of people may have lived in these structures during the early 6th century. These modifications show that the great public monuments of the Roman city were slowly losing their original purpose. Even while the circus continued to host races, sections of the building were being reused as housing. Similar developments occurred elsewhere in the city. Portions of the forum were dismantled to provide materials for private houses. The reuse of public buildings reflects a broader shift in urban life. The identity of the city as a classical Roman civic space was gradually fading. In its place, a different form of urban society was emerging, one in which religious institutions played a far more central role. As traditional public spaces declined, Christian buildings began to take on new social functions. The cathedral became not only a place of worship, but also a gathering place for the population. On Sundays and major feast days, large crowds gathered around the church. While religious services took place inside, many people remained outside in the courtyard or along the surrounding streets. There, they conducted business, discussed local matters, argued with neighbours, and sometimes attempted to settle disputes. Although such behaviour showed that many citizens were not fully engaged in the religious ceremony itself, it also demonstrated how central the church had become to public life. The basilica had effectively replaced older civic spaces as the focal point of communal activity. Another development that strengthened this sense of religious unity was the introduction of a new communal ritual known as the Rogation procession. This ceremony had first appeared in another Gallic city during a time of natural disasters and frightening events. The ritual soon spread across the region and was eventually adopted in Arles. Each year around the season of the Ascension, the population participated in several days of fasting, prayer, sermons, and public processions. The ceremony was intended to seek divine protection for the entire community. It could be performed in response to many dangers: floods, drought, famine, disease, warfare, or invasion. During one year, the people gathered to pray for relief from heavy rains and flooding. On another occasion, they prayed for rain during a severe drought. For such ceremonies to succeed, participation from the entire population was expected. Everyone was supposed to join the prayers and processions, from wealthy citizens to enslaved labourers. Religious leaders insisted that the safety of the whole community depended on this collective act of devotion. Yet even in these moments of unity, the city remained religiously diverse. Not every resident belonged to the Christian faith, and this reality raised important questions about what it meant for a city to describe itself as Christian. In the view of Caesarius, the religious world could be divided into three categories beyond Orthodox Christianity: pagans, Jews, and heretics. His sermons occasionally addressed heretical groups, especially those who followed alternative Christian teachings. But these communities had little influence over the general population. Far more attention was devoted to pagan traditions and to Judaism. Pagan practices had deep roots in local culture, while Jewish communities had long been established in Mediterranean cities. For this reason, Caesarius often warned Christians against adopting customs from these groups, and used comparisons with them to clarify what he believed true Christianity should look like. The Jewish community of Arles played a visible role in the city's life. Caesarius hoped that some Jews might eventually convert to Christianity, but his sermons were mainly directed at Christians rather than Jews themselves. He argued that the Christian faith represented the fulfillment of earlier religious traditions and attempted to persuade his listeners of its superiority. Christians were encouraged to explain their beliefs to neighbours who did not share their faith, including Jews and followers of older religions. The bishop believed that a strong example of moral behaviour could influence others more effectively than argument alone. At the same time, he tried to prevent Christians from adopting Jewish religious customs. Certain practices, such as strict dietary rules or special observance of the Sabbath, had attracted some Christians in earlier generations. To avoid confusion between the two religions, Caesarius emphasized the importance of Sunday worship and encouraged fasting on Saturdays during certain seasons. Christians were also warned against attending Jewish festivals or inviting Jews to religious meals, since differences in dietary customs might create social tension. Despite these efforts to maintain religious boundaries, Jews remained integrated into the civic life of Arles. They possessed legal rights as citizens and participated in many aspects of urban society. During times of crisis, such as military conflict, Jewish residents even took part in the defense of the city alongside their neighbors. Moments of tension did occur, especially during periods of political unrest, but Jewish communities were still recognized as part of the broader civic population. When Caesarius died, accounts describe a large public mourning in which people from many different backgrounds participated. Christians and Jews alike were said to have joined the procession honoring him. Such descriptions were often used in historical writing to emphasize the importance of a respected leader, yet they also reveal how the boundaries of the community were understood. Even those who did not share the same religious beliefs could still be seen as members of the same city. For Caesarius, the ideal Christian life was deeply social. Influenced by earlier Christian thinkers, he believed that the perfect community existed in the heavenly city, described in Christian teaching. Earthly society could never fully match that ideal, yet he still attempted to shape the local community according to similar principles. The model he looked to most often was the monastery. Monastic life represented a disciplined community devoted entirely to spiritual goals. Although monks and nuns lived apart from ordinary society, their lifestyle served as an example of the kind of devotion Caesarius wished to encourage among ordinary believers. He urged the people of Arles to adopt many habits associated with monastic discipline. Fasting, night vigils, regular prayer, and frequent attendance at religious services were strongly recommended. Additional daily prayer times were introduced at the cathedral so that believers could gather throughout the day. Sundays were to be reserved for spiritual reflection rather than ordinary labour. During prayer, Christians were encouraged not only to seek help for themselves, but also to pray for the welfare of others, including their enemies. Yet these expectations placed heavy demands on ordinary people. Most citizens had to work long hours to support their families. Craftsmen, labourers, and farmers could rarely attend multiple services each day. Even dedicating an entire Sunday to religious activity was difficult for those who depended on daily labour for survival. In a world filled with uncertainty and hardship, many people naturally prayed for immediate needs, such as health, security, and prosperity, rather than focusing solely on eternal salvation. Another practice strongly encouraged by Caesarius was the reading of sacred texts. He believed that Scripture provided guidance for living a Christian life and urged believers to listen carefully during church services and to read the texts again at home. Long winter evenings, he suggested, offered an ideal opportunity for such reading. Some individuals objected that they had no time for this activity, especially if their days were already filled with work or social obligations. Illiteracy presented an even greater challenge. Many members of the population could not read at all. Caesarius proposed practical solutions. Those who could read were encouraged to read aloud for others. Illiterate believers could hire someone to read Scripture to them, or listen to passages read in church. He also recommended memorizing short prayers and psalms, so that they could be repeated during daily work. Even so, memorizing long passages was difficult for many people, especially those without formal training in reading and writing. Recognizing these limitations, Caesarius also emphasized another path to spiritual life that was more accessible to everyone: generosity. Giving to the poor and supporting the church were presented as powerful expressions of faith. Wealthy citizens were encouraged to donate part of their income, often in the form of a tenth of their earnings or harvest. Gifts of food, clothing, money, or assistance to those in need were all considered acts of charity. These donations supported not only the poor, but also the clergy and the religious communities who depended on public generosity for their survival. Even individuals with very little could participate in charitable acts. Offering a small piece of bread, sharing water with someone in need, forgiving an injury, or helping reconcile enemies were all seen as forms of generosity. In this way, acts of kindness became an essential part of everyday religious life. Charity allowed believers who could not devote long hours to prayer or study to express their faith through practical actions. Members of Caesarius's congregation did not respond to his expectations in the same way. Wealthy citizens faced a particular dilemma when they were encouraged to give alms and pay tithes through the church. Traditionally, generosity among elites had reinforced systems of patronage. When aristocrats distributed gifts directly, they strengthened networks of loyalty and obligation that increased their prestige and influence. Giving through the bishop altered this pattern. Instead of gaining clients and social leverage, donors were promised spiritual rewards and moral honour. Some members of the elite clearly embraced charitable giving. The large sums needed to ransom captives, something Caesarius did frequently, could only have come from wealthy patrons. Yet it is unlikely that these benefactors completely abandoned the older forms of patronage that defined the aristocratic life. More likely, charitable donations functioned alongside traditional systems of generosity rather than replacing them. As a result, the charity of the rich probably never reached the level of total generosity imagined in the bishop's preaching, because other forms of social obligation still competed with it. For people who were not wealthy, the meaning of generosity was quite different. Acts of charity often fit comfortably within local customs of mutual support. Among ordinary people, sharing food or helping neighbours during hardship was already a familiar part of community life. Caesarius himself once praised a group that included labourers and working poor for their willingness to give alms. However, The expectation of paying a tenth of one's income to the church created far greater resistance. For families already burdened with rents, owed to landlords and taxes demanded by political authorities, surrendering a tenth of their income could be extremely difficult. It is therefore not surprising that attempts were later made to enforce the payment of tithes more strictly. Even if many people resisted some of the bishop's demands, this does not mean they ignored religious life altogether. The Christians of Arles regularly attended church services, brought their children for baptism, and attempted to raise them within the Christian faith. Yet their hesitation to follow Caesarius's stricter religious instructions shows that they maintained considerable independence in shaping their own religious behaviour. Many individuals chose which teachings they would accept, which they would ignore, and which they would adapt to suit their everyday lives. Several of the moral values promoted in Caesarius's sermons already aligned with ideas widely accepted in the community. He spoke frequently about peace, harmony, and justice within society. He condemned dishonest trade, exploitation of the poor, and acts of violence. These were not radical ideas. In fact, many of the offences he denounced were already illegal under Roman law. Crimes such as murder, theft, perjury, rape, and sacrilege were punishable by the authorities. On these issues, the bishop's moral teaching reinforced standards that people already recognized. The situation was different when Caesarius urged believers to follow the demanding standards of monastic life. In these areas, the resistance was stronger. The problem was not simply that people failed to live up to ideals they admired. Often they rejected those ideals altogether because they seemed unrealistic within ordinary social life. One of the virtues that Caesarius emphasized above all others was charity. In his sermons, it appeared as the central bond holding society together. Without it, he argued, all other religious practices lost their value. Even a person who lacked other forms of devotion could achieve salvation through genuine acts of charity. In everyday life, the concept of charity did have practical appeal. In a small community like Arles, disputes were common. Conflicts over property, debts, grazing rights, and access to water could easily escalate into long-lasting hostility. Neighbours sometimes refused to speak to one another for months or even years after minor disagreements. In this environment, the principle of charity offered a way to restore peace. It encouraged people to forgive injuries, negotiate settlements, and accept mediation rather than resorting to prolonged conflict. The bishop himself often served as a mediator in disputes, and members of the community were also encouraged to intervene when conflicts arose. Understood in this practical sense, charity meant maintaining social stability through compromise and reconciliation. Many people were willing to accept such guidance. Yet Caesarius pushed the principle further by demanding unconditional love toward enemies. At that point, the response changed. His audience frequently argued that such expectations were unrealistic, and his repeated warnings suggest that the ideal remained difficult to accept. Another teaching that proved even more difficult for the community concerned sexual behaviour. Caesarius praised chastity as one of the highest Christian virtues. In its most rigorous form, this meant complete sexual renunciation for life, a standard followed by monks and nuns. However, he did not expect most believers to adopt such an extreme discipline permanently. Marriage was still regarded as a respectable institution, whose purpose was the creation of legitimate families. According to his teaching, married couples who remained faithful, raised their children responsibly, and supported charitable works could still achieve salvation. Nevertheless, complete sexual abstinence remained the highest standard against which all other forms of life were measured. Virgins were believed to receive the greatest spiritual reward, widows a lesser one, and married couples the least. Even within marriage, Caesarius attempted to impose a strict system of sexual restraint. Husbands were advised to avoid sexual relations during numerous times throughout the year. These included the early days of marriage, periods of fasting such as Lent, the days leading up to important religious festivals, and certain stages of pregnancy. Intercourse was also discouraged during menstruation and during the days surrounding baptism for new converts. Violations of these rules were described in alarming terms. Caesarius even warned that children conceived under improper circumstances might be born with physical disabilities. Yet the constant repetition of these warnings reveals how difficult it was for ordinary families to follow such restrictions. For most couples, these expectations were far removed from the realities of daily life. Sexual relations outside marriage were condemned even more strongly. Caesarius criticized men who maintained relationships with slave women or other partners outside marriage. However, such behavior appears to have been widely accepted among the male elite. Rather than being condemned, men sometimes boasted about these relationships among their peers. The double standard between men and women was striking. While men faced little social punishment for sexual misconduct, women accused of similar behavior could face severe public condemnation. The bishop also confronted the widespread practice of concubinage. In Roman society, this form of partnership was often socially recognized and long-lasting, even if it lacked the legal status of marriage. It commonly occurred between partners of unequal social status who could not easily marry. Although it was not illegal, Caesarius considered the custom morally dangerous. He pointed out the contradiction in men who demanded sexual purity from their future wives, while living freely with concubines themselves. He also warned that children born from such relationships faced legal disadvantages. In many cases, these children could not inherit property or social status from their fathers. Through such arguments, Caesarius attempted to persuade men to abandon concubinage and pursue legitimate marriages instead. Despite his efforts, the practice remained common. Social realities encouraged it. Elite men often delayed marriage while waiting for a suitable alliance with another wealthy family. During these years, concubinage offered a convenient solution. Because influential men were involved, the bishop could not easily impose severe punishments without risking confrontation with powerful members of the community. Instead, he adopted a more subtle strategy. Men who had engaged in sexual relationships before marriage could be denied the traditional public blessing during their wedding ceremony. This decision placed moral pressure on individuals, while avoiding open conflict with the social elite. Another sensitive issue concerned the control of family size. Economic considerations played an important role in the decisions of families in late antique society. Poor households needed to balance the value of additional labour from children against the cost of feeding and raising them. Wealthy families faced different concerns. Since family property was usually divided among heirs, too many children could weaken the financial stability of the next generation. For these reasons, many families aimed to limit the number of children they had. Several methods were used, including periods of abstinence, contraceptive practices, abortion, and sometimes the abandonment of unwanted infants. Caesarius strongly condemned most of these practices. He believed the desire to restrict family size reflected greed and a lack of trust in divine providence. His sermons condemned abortion and contraception in especially severe language. In his view, these acts were equivalent to taking a life before it had the chance to exist. The only acceptable solution, he argued, was either to raise the child or to entrust it to another household. At the same time, he encouraged couples who wished to avoid further pregnancies to practice mutual abstinence within marriage. Yet the desire for children remained strong. Families without heirs often feared for their future security and the continuation of their property. When couples struggled with infertility, some turned to remedies drawn from traditional folk practices. Caesarius rejected these methods as superstitious and urged couples instead to accept their situation through religious devotion. Childless couples, he argued, could dedicate themselves to acts of charity and spiritual devotion. In such cases, he emphasized the idea of spiritual offspring. Good works performed for the benefit of others were described as a form of symbolic parenthood. Through generosity and moral action, a person could leave behind a lasting legacy even without biological children. Conflicts between episcopal ideals and social habits also appeared in matters of leisure and celebration. Caesarius frequently criticized customs of heavy drinking, feasting, dancing, and the telling of bawdy stories during gatherings. For many people, these activities were essential elements of social life. Drinking played a central role in hospitality and friendship. Guests expected generous servings of wine, and hosts risked offending visitors if they failed to provide enough. Drinking could also function as a display of masculinity and social status. Competitions sometimes developed over who could consume the most wine. Participants mocked those who drank moderately, accusing them of lacking courage or strength. For the bishop, such behaviour represented moral disorder, but for many members of the community, it was a familiar expression of social solidarity. Large communal feasts were especially common in rural areas. Farmers sometimes invited neighbours and relatives to gatherings that lasted several days. The host provided abundant food and drink, sometimes consuming supplies that might otherwise have sustained the household for months. While this might appear wasteful from an outside perspective, such events served important social purposes. Feasting reinforced relationships, displayed generosity, and strengthened bonds within the community. These traditions even extended into the celebration of Christian festivals. Holidays such as Christmas, Easter, and the feast days of saints often included elaborate meals, dancing, and drinking. Caesarius attempted to encourage more modest celebrations and urged believers to invite the poor to share their meals. Yet popular expectations of festivity remained strong. In some gatherings, people even raised toasts in honour of saints or angels. Caesarius condemned this custom as disrespectful and insisted that true devotion required moderation rather than intoxication. From his perspective, such practices resembled older pagan traditions. Yet for many participants, these rituals represented their own form of religious expression rather than a rejection of Christianity. Music, dancing, and storytelling also formed part of these celebrations. In a society where life could be harsh and uncertain, such moments of collective enjoyment held deep importance. These performances transmitted cultural values, reinforced group identity, and provided relief from the hardships of daily labour. The bishop proposed alternative forms of devotion. He encouraged people to spend their leisure time reading sacred texts or reciting prayers and psalms. Instead of extravagant feasting, he urged believers to give their resources to the poor. Resisting social pressure to drink excessively was presented as a form of moral heroism. Yet these proposals often clashed with the realities of everyday life. A growing cultural divide separated religious specialists from the majority of believers. Clergy, monks, nuns, and wealthy patrons possessed far greater freedom to devote time to prayer, study, and charity. Their livelihoods were supported by donations, church property, and labour performed by others. Ordinary people lived under very different conditions. Farmers, craftsmen, and labourers depended on daily work for survival. Their responsibilities left little time for the rigorous, spiritual routines advocated by church leaders. As a result, the religious expectations promoted by bishops could never fully align with the practical realities of lay life. This tension produced an important question about religious culture during this period. Were the differences between clergy and ordinary believers simply differences in commitment, or did they represent deeper cultural divisions? Some scholars have suggested that two distinct forms of Christianity emerged. One, practiced by educated elites and religious specialists, and another, shaped by the customs and traditions of the broader population. The evidence from Arles suggests that the situation was complex. Many behaviours criticised by Caesarius did not represent rejection of Christianity. Instead, they reflected efforts by ordinary people to adapt the new religion to existing patterns of social life. The result was a diverse religious landscape in which official teachings and popular practices interacted constantly. This diversity becomes even more visible when examining behaviours that church leaders described as pagan. The term itself did not represent a label used by the people involved. It was a critical term applied by Christian authorities to describe practices that fell outside their control. In reality, many of these customs blended older traditions with new religious meanings. Some of these practices appeared within the city itself, while others were more common in the countryside. Yet the distinction between urban and rural religion was never absolute. Behaviours considered rustic or pagan could be found in both settings. Understanding these traditions requires attention to the social environment in which they developed. By the late 5th and early 6th centuries, the countryside around Arles was undergoing noticeable changes. Elements of Roman culture were slowly fading. Rural settlements began to shift, and patterns of life increasingly resembled those that had existed before Roman rule. Archaeological discoveries reveal that some hilltop settlements abandoned during the Roman era were reoccupied during this time. These fortified locations offered natural protection and may have provided refuge during periods of instability. Warfare and political conflict in the region made rural life uncertain, and communities sometimes sought safety in locations that were easier to defend. Caves that had been used as shelters in prehistoric times were also occupied again. Excavations have uncovered evidence of cooking utensils, animal bones, and domestic objects indicating that families lived in these places for extended periods. Such settlements may have served as temporary refugees during times of conflict or famine. At the same time, many of the large rural villas that had once dominated the landscape began to decline. Some continued to function, but others were abandoned. Large estates increasingly came under the control of powerful landowners who managed their properties from central locations. Small farmers often struggled under heavy taxes and financial pressure. The countryside, therefore, became dominated by a steep social hierarchy. A small group of wealthy landowners controlled vast territories. Beneath them were smaller property holders, who were often vulnerable to debt and economic pressure. Below this group were tenant farmers who cultivated land belonging to others. At the bottom of the hierarchy were enslaved labourers who possessed few legal rights. These social transformations shaped the religious life of the region. As traditional Roman structures weakened, older local traditions resurfaced. At the same time, Christian leaders attempted to strengthen the influence of the Church among rural populations. The coexistence of these two trends reveals both the success and the limits of Christianization in the world of late antiquity. By the 6th century, the ownership of land around the city of Arles had changed dramatically. Most of the countryside was no longer worked by those who actually owned it. Instead, large estates belonged to powerful figures who rarely set foot in the fields themselves. Among them were wealthy lay aristocrats, bishops and church institutions, and the ruling kings who had inherited former imperial lands after the collapse of Roman administration. The Christian church had also become a major landholder. Local parish churches, monasteries, the Cathedral of Arles, and eventually even the distant church in Rome, possessed estates that stretched across the region. Yet despite this concentration of ownership, the everyday labour that sustained rural life still took place within the small world of the peasant household. Whether the people involved were slaves, tenant farmers, or small landholders, agricultural work continued to be organised around families. Each household functioned as a unit of production. Men, women, and children worked together to maintain crops, care for animals, and preserve food. Even on church property, the rhythms of work were determined not by distant owners, but by the families who lived on the land. Occasionally, tensions arose between rural communities and outside authorities. On one estate belonging to a convent in Arles, the local peasants once complained that Gothic soldiers and officers were hunting wild boars on their lands. The disturbance affected the entire household community that depended on the property. Such incidents reveal how closely the livelihood of peasant families depended on the stability of their environment. Agricultural life in the region followed patterns shaped by geography. In the dry plains of the Crau, herding livestock was the dominant activity. In the marshy landscapes of the Camargue, people fished, raised horses, and harvested salt. In the more fertile lands surrounding the city, farmers cultivated the classic Mediterranean combination of grain, wine, and olive oil. These three products formed the foundation of the local economy and provided the basic necessities of life. The existence of these farmers was rarely easy. Peasants lived under constant pressure from multiple directions. Landlords demanded rent or labour, political authorities collected taxes, and families required food and protection. At the same time, the success of every harvest depended on unpredictable forces such as rainfall, temperature, and disease. A single season of bad weather could threaten an entire household. In such a fragile environment, survival depended on careful management of limited resources. Failure often meant hunger or starvation. Success meant little more than survival until the next season. Yet despite these hardships, rural communities developed systems of knowledge that allowed them to endure. Over generations, peasants created a practical culture shaped by experience. This culture helped them understand their environment, organize their labour, and cope with the uncertainties of nature. Peasant society in the region was not completely separate from urban life. Villagers spoke the same language as city residents, lived under the same political authorities, and increasingly participated in the same religious traditions. Nevertheless, their daily routines differed significantly from those of the urban population. Rural culture was preserved through direct teaching and observation. Knowledge passed from one generation to the next through demonstration rather than written instruction. A farmer learned how to prune vines or plant new shoots, not from books but from watching experienced workers. Techniques were transmitted through imitation, advice, and practical experience. In this way, agricultural knowledge formed a continuous tradition that stretched across generations. The culture of rural life extended far beyond farming techniques. It also included family relationships, customs surrounding marriage and inheritance, and methods for organising labour within the household. Communities developed rituals for celebration and mourning, as well as practical approaches to healing illness. Everyday wisdom circulated through proverbs, songs, humour, and stories repeated at gatherings and festivals. One of the most important parts of this cultural system involved beliefs about the natural world. In a society where survival depended heavily on weather and seasonal rhythms, peasants developed traditions that attempted to explain and influence the forces around them. Rituals and ceremonies were closely tied to agricultural cycles. Festivals, offerings, and symbolic actions were believed to protect crops, encourage rainfall, and ensure successful harvests. This worldview formed a kind of traditional cosmology. It offered explanations for misfortune and provided methods for responding to uncertainty. Ritual practices were meant to guard communities against drought, disease, and other threats beyond human control. Through these ceremonies, rural populations attempted to reduce the dangers of their environment, secure the stability needed for another year of survival. Such traditions created a strong connection between agricultural life and religious practice. Festivals often coincided with important moments in the farming calendar. Ritual actions accompanied planting, harvesting, and seasonal transitions. These practices were not merely symbolic. They were seen as practical responses to the unpredictable forces that shaped rural existence. It was precisely this network of beliefs and rituals that church leaders like Caesarius sought to transform. His efforts to promote Christianity and eliminate older religious practices brought him into direct conflict with many of the customs that had guided rural communities for generations. Knowledge about rural religion during this period survives largely because of these conflicts. In his sermons, Caesarius repeatedly criticized practices that he believed were remnants of pagan belief. Ironically, these condemnations provide one of the few surviving glimpses into the religious life of the countryside. Yet, interpreting this evidence is difficult. Caesarius himself came from a very different social world. As a bishop, an aristocrat, and a resident of the city, he had limited, direct experience with the daily life of peasants. Much of what he learned about rural customs probably reached him through reports from landowners or local clergy. Such information could easily be incomplete or misunderstood. His descriptions were also shaped by a common prejudice among educated elites of the time. Peasants were often portrayed as simple or ignorant people whose traditions reflected a lack of understanding. These attitudes inevitably influenced how rural practices were described and judged. An even greater challenge arises from the way Caesarius used the word pagan. In his sermons, he applied this label to a wide range of behaviours. Some clearly belong to ancient religious traditions such as sacrifices and dedications at sacred sites. Others were far more ambiguous. Activities like bathing in rivers on certain feast days or exchanging gifts during the new year were also condemned as pagan, even though they may already have been adapted to Christian contexts or stripped of their earlier religious meaning. Because of this broad condemnation, later readers sometimes assumed that every rural custom represented a survival of pagan religion. A closer examination reveals a far more complex situation. The religious life of rural communities contained a mixture of traditions, loyalties, and interpretations. The population of the countryside can be understood as falling into several broad categories. Some individuals still identified openly with older religious traditions. Others embraced Christianity according to the expectations promoted by bishops and church authorities. A much larger group occupied a middle ground. These people considered themselves Christian, yet continued to practice a variety of rituals that blended older customs with newer beliefs. Determining where individuals belonged within these categories is not always easy. One common marker of Christian identity was baptism. By the 6th century, the practice of baptizing infants had become increasingly widespread. Even so, many believers still delayed baptism until late in life, remaining catechumens for decades. At the same time, receiving baptism did not necessarily guarantee that someone abandoned older traditions. Some individuals who'd been baptized still participated in practices associated with traditional religion. This shows that religious identity was not defined by a single ceremony, but by a range of beliefs and behaviours. Attendance at church services provides a clearer indication of Christian affiliation. Participation in communal worship required ongoing commitment and could not easily be imposed on unwilling individuals. Even those who had not yet been baptized were expected to attend the early parts of the liturgy. Because rural communities were small and closely connected, social pressure likely encouraged most residents to appear at church on major occasions. Many of the people criticized in Caesarius' sermons, therefore, probably considered themselves Christians. They attended church, listened to sermons, and participated in Christian rituals. Yet they also continued to perform practices that church authorities regarded as unacceptable. Some of these practices reflected deep loyalty to older religious traditions. In certain areas, people continued to rebuild shrines that had been destroyed by Christian authorities. Others defended sacred sites when attempts were made to remove them. These actions suggest that not everyone accepted the religious transformation promoted by the Church. Nevertheless, most rural inhabitants did not see their behaviour as a rejection of Christianity. Instead, they combined different elements of belief. Traditional rituals were performed alongside Christian ones, without necessarily creating a sense of contradiction. For example, farmers sometimes continued to offer prayers or small gifts at natural locations long regarded as sacred. Groves of trees, springs, and rural altars served as focal points for ceremonies connected to agriculture and fertility. These sites had been respected for generations, long before the spread of Christianity. Trees held a particularly strong symbolic significance. Even when sacred trees were cut down, some villagers refused to use the wood for ordinary purposes such as fuel. Their reluctance reflected a lingering sense of reverence associated with these places. Ritual gatherings at such locations often ended with communal meals. Food and drink offered during ceremonies were shared among participants. These events combined religious symbolism with social celebration, reinforcing bonds within the community. From the perspective of church authorities, such practices clearly conflicted with Christian teaching. Yet for many peasants they served a practical purpose. They addressed concerns about harvests, health, and protection from misfortune, areas where official religious rituals sometimes seemed less relevant to everyday life. In response, people developed a flexible approach to belief. Christian symbols might be used alongside traditional actions. Someone might make the sign of the cross before participating in a communal meal connected to an older ritual. Such gestures acknowledged Christian identity without abandoning established customs. This form of religious blending was not unusual in societies undergoing cultural change. Similar patterns have appeared in many parts of the world where older traditions encountered new religious systems. In rural Gaul, the result was a complex religious landscape. Christian teachings, local customs, seasonal rituals, and practical concerns all interacted with one another. The outcome was not a simple replacement of one religion by another, but a gradual process of adaptation. For leaders like Caesarius, this situation posed a serious challenge. His vision of Christianity demanded clear boundaries between acceptable and unacceptable practices. Yet the daily life of rural communities rarely followed such strict divisions. Peasant culture had developed over centuries as a response to the demands of the natural world. It contained systems of knowledge and belief that addressed the realities of agricultural life. Transforming this culture required more than preaching sermons or issuing commands. It meant confronting traditions deeply woven into the rhythms of everyday existence. The struggle between these different visions of religious life would shape the history of the region for generations. Church leaders sought to establish uniform practices and beliefs, while rural communities continued to adapt Christianity in ways that reflected their own experiences and needs. Caesarius tried to reshape the religious life of the peasants around Arles through two connected but distinct efforts. One was the spread of Christian teaching, ritual, and moral discipline. The other was the destruction of older sacred habits that continue to survive beneath, beside, or within outward Christianity. These two goals were tied together, yet they create different challenges and demanded different responses. Teaching Christianity meant introducing people more deeply to Christian ideas, Christian worship, and Christian expectations for daily life. It was constructive in nature. It depended on sermons, instruction, repeated moral guidance, pressure from the community, and warnings about judgment after death. The effort to eliminate older religious customs was harsher. It aimed not simply to add Christian practice to village life, but to break the hold of inherited rituals, beliefs, and habits that people still carried forward from the past. That work required Caesarius to present Christianity as exclusive, not merely superior. He had to attack traditional ways of understanding the world, weaken the customs through which non-Christian religion was learned, and interfere with the family and communal patterns that passed those customs from one generation to the next. Persuasion remained important, but repression and force became far more visible in this second campaign. The main base for both of these efforts was the rural church, served by local clergy. It was there that converts were taught, baptisms were performed, Mass was celebrated, and Episcopal preaching reached village audiences during regular visits across the countryside. Yet the rural church had serious limits at the beginning of the 6th century. These churches were not evenly scattered across the diocese. They were concentrated in the more settled and populated districts, which meant that people living in remote places could remain far from the ordinary reach of organised pastoral care. At the same time, many country Christians gathered not in parish churches, but in private churches, built on aristocratic estates. Those churches often remained under the practical control of powerful landowners, rather than under the close direction of the bishop. As a result, they could not always be used to carry out a consistent program of religious reform. Even where a proper parish existed, the local clergy often lacked the independence needed to turn the church into an effective engine of religious change. Priests and deacons could read scripture during worship, but they were not always permitted to explain it through their own preaching. They could receive gifts made to the church, but the authority over those resources remained with the bishop. Lands assigned for local support were likewise controlled from above. Without the freedom to teach in an active and persuasive way, or to use church wealth to build loyalty through local patronage, rural clergy could only do so much to shape belief and behaviour. Over time, Caesarius tried to strengthen this weak structure. Early reforms required country people who worshipped in private churches to attend the cathedral or recognise parish churches on the greatest feasts of the year, where the bishop and his representatives could influence them more directly. Later reforms also sought to increase the number of clergy available for service, by making ordination more accessible, and by responding to the growing number of churches across the region. New churches were being founded, both on estates and in parish settings, and this expansion gave the church a broader physical presence in the countryside. Still, the more controversial issue was not simply the number of churches, but the question of local authority. Bishops were often unwilling to grant parish clergy a greater share in preaching and financial control, because they saw these powers as central to episcopal status. Caesarius had to work carefully to persuade his fellow bishops that allowing priests and deacons greater freedom would not weaken their rank. On the contrary, he argued that it would allow bishops to fulfill their true calling more effectively. He described the bishop as a spiritual watchman set above the whole church, responsible not merely for defending against great public sins, but also for correcting the smaller faults that entered daily life almost unnoticed. In this vision, the bishop was not meant to spend his strength supervising property, managing estates, or guarding revenues. Those tasks, Caesarius argued, could be handed over to others. What mattered most was the care of souls. He criticised bishops who were too absorbed in wealth and administration, suggesting that some were more interested in maintaining splendid households and impressive hospitality than in serving the poor or guiding the faithful. By shifting responsibility for routine management to lay assistants and junior clerics, bishops could devote themselves to preaching, vigilance, correction, and pastoral oversight. This argument supported parish reform in a very practical way. If bishops no longer insisted on direct control over every local asset, parish clergy could become more active and useful. Caesarius answered the expected objections by insisting that spiritual care was a higher form of charity than material generosity alone. Feeding the poor remained good, but guiding souls towards salvation was better. He also pressed the issue of preaching with unusual force. Bishops, he said, should not preach only on the greatest feast days. They should address their people every Sunday. Since their responsibility extended across both town and countryside, preaching had to spread beyond the bishop himself. Priests and deacons, especially in rural parishes, needed permission and encouragement to teach regularly. Some bishops resisted on the grounds that neither they nor their clergy possessed the learning, memory, or eloquence required for public preaching. Caesarius answered that fear by lowering the standard. A preacher did not need refined rhetoric. Plain themes and everyday language were enough. If even that seemed too difficult, clergy could read approved homilies written by respected earlier teachers. If a deacon was worthy to proclaim the gospel text, Caesarius reasoned, he should also be considered worthy to read aloud the sermons of trusted Christian authorities. This practical solution allowed the message to spread even where local talent was limited. These reforms gradually took shape in church legislation within the province. Parish churches received increased authority over their own resources, at least for the support of clergy and the upkeep of buildings. In some dioceses, bishops could still claim a portion of parish revenues when finances were strained, but the balance had shifted. Compared with other regions, this gave local churches significant room to act. Soon after, priests were formally allowed to preach not only in cities but throughout the countryside, and in the absence of priests, deacons were permitted to recite approved homilies. This was still uncommon in much of the Western Church. In addition, parish priests were authorized to train young unmarried lectors in their own households. These boys were to be fed, taught the Psalms, immersed in Scripture, and prepared either for future clerical service, or, if they later chose marriage, for respectable Christian adulthood. The goal was to create a stable local supply of educated churchmen, and to form them from an early age within a disciplined Christian environment. The clergy who led local parishes benefited most from these changes. With greater influence over church resources, they could begin to practice on a small scale the same kind of patronage that had long strengthened episcopal authority. With the right to preach, they gained a teaching role that had once belonged mainly to bishops. With the ability to train younger clerics, they could surround themselves with small religious households and shape future leadership. All of this raised their standing, but it also made their churches more effective instruments of religious transformation. A parish priest could now support the needy, reward loyalty, strengthen devotion to local saints, and repeatedly teach Christian values in familiar surroundings. This constant pastoral rhythm mattered. If Christianity was to take deeper root in rural life, it would do so less through rare dramatic interventions than through steady repetition in the parish setting. Caesarius also understood that the right to preach meant little if clergy lacked the education to do it properly. For that reason, he insisted on minimum standards of learning. Priests and deacons were expected to know Scripture well, and the young lectors receiving parish training were drilled in psalms and sacred reading. Caesarius also helped by distributing collections of his own sermons. These were written in a simple style for recitation in local churches on major feast days and other occasions. The process of copying and circulation was itself important. He knew that many scribes were inexperienced and that errors could creep into texts. He therefore encouraged correction, recopying, and further distribution, asking clergy to make improved copies and pass them on to neighbouring communities. Through this network, his ideas could travel far beyond the places he could personally visit. Since a bishop could only reach most rural churches occasionally, the sermon collections became a way of extending his presence and influence. Priests and deacons could repeat his message again and again, even in areas where he never appeared in person. Still, parish churches were not the only places where rural people encountered Christianity. Many peasants joined their landlords in worship at estate churches built on private land. These were not always recognised as full parishes, and their clergy often remained effectively dependent on the estate owner. Their property was not truly independent church property, and the reforms that increased parish rights did not necessarily apply to them. Whether the clergy serving there could preach or not often depended more on the will of the landlord than on the bishop. Caesarius tried to reach these congregations whenever he could, especially during visits to rural estates that coincided with his wider diocesan tours. He did not rely on a single method. His broader strategy ranged across a spectrum, from persuasion to force, often mixing both in ways that reflected the status of the people he was addressing. Like many religious reformers, Caesarius preferred persuasion when he believed that his audience still shared enough of his own language, habits, and assumptions to be reasoned with. He turned more quickly toward coercion when dealing with practices he saw as stubbornly alien to Christian order, especially the customs he classified as pagan. His strategy also changed, depending on who was involved. Women, children, tenants, and slaves were more likely to be subjected to direct pressure, because society already granted them less freedom and assumed they possessed less judgment. Peasants as a group were more vulnerable to coercion than townspeople, because Caesarius regarded their customs with less respect and understood them less easily. Even so, he did not regard them as members of an entirely separate civilization. He believed that reason was universal and that beneath local habits they could still be persuaded. For that reason, he often preferred methods that felt like persuasion, even when they included strong social pressure or threats of punishment. His persuasive program followed a clear pattern. First, he tried to destroy the mental framework that made older religious practices seem useful or meaningful. If people could be convinced that these customs were foolish, powerless, or empty, they might abandon them voluntarily. Second, he offered Christian rituals and beliefs as substitutes that could meet the same needs in a better way. Third, he insisted that only Christianity gave legitimate access to the hidden forces shaping human life and the natural world. In his sermons, he attacked traditional customs directly. When speaking about lunar eclipses, for example, he argued that making noise with horns or bells could not influence the moon. He explained the event as part of the natural order and mocked the idea that a heavenly body needed human help or feared human silence. In another sermon, he condemned the use of pagan names for the days of the week by reducing the gods behind those names to immoral, dead humans who had been falsely elevated. He then contrasted such names with the simpler naming pattern found in Scripture and urged Christians to speak differently. In each case, the pattern was the same. He tried to make inherited custom look irrational and then replaced it with Christian speech and Christian understanding. Scripture stood at the centre of this persuasive effort. When condemning the use of amulets for healing, Caesarius did not merely say that such objects were improper. He explained their apparent effectiveness as a deception of evil spiritual powers and contrasted that deception with the truth of biblical teaching. Written charms worn on the body, he argued, should not replace the words of God kept in the heart. Those who made such objects, asked for them, or approved them, placed themselves in danger. His warnings were reinforced by threats of punishment after death, and by vivid contrast between salvation and damnation. Yet he also knew that sermons alone rarely changed people as deeply as lived experience did. So he worked to support his message through action. His acts of charity were part of that effort. By feeding the poor, clothing captives, ransoming prisoners, and assisting the needy, Caesarius presented himself not only as a teacher, but as a patron whose religion produced visible benefits. These actions could create gratitude, loyalty, and moral dependence. They also showed that Christian leaders were able to perform social functions once associated with older structures of communal life. The cathedral and parish churches under his supervision gathered food, money, and clothing and redistributed these to widows, orphans, the poor, and other vulnerable people. As parish churches gained more control over their own resources, rural priests, too, could become local patrons. Their churches became places where Christian virtues were not merely preached, but displayed in action. Those who depended on such support were naturally drawn into closer attachment to the church. Material need, personal gratitude, and religious instruction all reinforced one another. In this way, charity worked not only as mercy, but also as a means of reshaping allegiance. Miracles served a similar purpose, but even more dramatically. Stories of healing and exorcism offered proof that Christian holy men could deliver results that people once sought from older gods, sacred sites, or local healers. Miracles could bind people in obligation just as charity did, but they also provided striking evidence that the Christian God truly ruled the unseen world. In the countryside, Caesarius was credited with several such acts. During a parish visit to a fortified rural settlement, a woman brought him a slave girl, believed to be tormented at night by a being the peasants associated with Diana. Caesarius investigated through clergy, then blessed the girl and gave her consecrated oil. The oppression ended. In other places, he was said to have driven demons from a young cleric during Mass and healed a possessed girl in front of her community. He also took part in cures outside church buildings, including the healing of a crippled woman in the hills. Such stories mattered because they taught several lessons at once. They recast the old gods as malevolent spirits, presented Christian ritual as more powerful than traditional remedies, and made the bishop appear as an effective mediator between divine power and human suffering. The use of Caesarius's relics by rural people suggests that these ideas could take hold in practice. In one case, villagers hung his staff in an abandoned bath building to expel harmful spirits believed to dwell there. In another, a landowner turned the same staff into a cross and set it on a hill to protect against destructive hailstorms. Such gestures reveal an important point. The contest was not only between belief and unbelief. It was also between rival ways of accessing power, safety, healing, and protection. Caesarius wanted the Christian God to be seen not as an additional source of help alongside older forces, but as the only power that truly mattered. Yet persuasion and wonder were not the whole story. Caesarius also endorsed direct repression. Earlier bishops in the Roman world had used imperial backing against non-Christian religion, but Caesarius could not rely on that kind of support. The political world had changed. Although anti-pagan laws still existed in inherited legal traditions, there is no strong sign that he used them in any systematic way. In practice, the most effective forms of pressure in the countryside came not from the state, but from social hierarchy itself. Landowners ruled estates, household heads ruled families, patrons guided dependents. Caesarius turned to these existing relationships and asked influential Christians to enforce religious discipline within their own circles. He had long urged his listeners to repeat his teaching to relatives, dependents, friends, and slaves. Now he went further and asked them to add severity where words failed. He assigned different tasks in different sermons. Landowners were told to destroy sacred trees, altars, and shrines on their property if local people still used them for prayer. They were also told to punish offenders. Those who continued such practices were to be rebuked harshly. If correction failed, they might be beaten. In some passages, Caesarius went further still, approving humiliating punishments or even physical restraint. Heads of households were likewise ordered to remove forbidden customs from domestic celebrations, especially at key seasonal moments, when older rituals still survived beneath a Christian surface. Equals could be pressured through shame and exclusion. Dependents could be disciplined with blows. Caesarius made no attempt to hide the severity of this program. This coercion rested on more than social habit. It also rested on a powerful religious logic. For Caesarius, baptized Christians who returned to forbidden rites were not merely making harmless mistakes. They were deserters. They had abandoned Christ for the devil, life for death, light for darkness. This language of desertion gave his rhetoric a military tone. Just as a soldier who abandoned the battle line betrayed his earthly king, the Christian who abandoned the church betrayed the heavenly ruler. From that comparison followed the threat of punishment. Caesarius repeatedly warned that those who refused correction would face eternal fire. Repression in this world, however severe, could therefore be presented as a desperate mercy compared with the endless suffering of the next. In the short term, such punishments could at least suppress visible behaviour. They could make public performance of older rites more dangerous and more costly. But Caesarius was also thinking in the long term. He understood that traditional religion survived because it was woven into ordinary life through stories, seasonal habits, sayings, domestic rituals, and repeated communal acts. It endured because children learned it almost without noticing, by growing up inside it. If that chain of transmission could be broken, the old religion might weaken across generations. Public repression was one way to interfere with that process. But Caesarius knew it could never fully succeed. People could hide what they did. Rituals could move into secrecy. Parents could continue teaching their children quietly inside the household. No amount of outside pressure could watch every corner of village life. A more effective method was to remove some of the young from that environment altogether and place them under direct Christian formation. This was one reason the training of young lectors mattered so much. Boys taken into the households of parish priests were separated, at least for a time, from the ordinary rhythms of peasant family culture. They were instructed in psalms, scripture, and discipline under the authority of spiritual fathers, rather than their natural families. Even if many of them never rose far in the clergy, their upbringing could still produce adult men, shaped more deeply by Christian teaching than by inherited local custom. If they later married and raised families of their own, they could help extend that change into the next generation. The scale of this system was limited, but its purpose was clear. It created people whose formative years had been spent inside a church-centered world. Even so, the situation Caesarius faced was not that of a missionary entering a completely foreign civilization. The peasants of his region did not speak another language or belong to a wholly separate cultural universe. They shared much of the same world as the townspeople and clergy around them. That fact explains both the limits of his coercion and the shape of his success. He did not attempt to force every villager into a total break with all inherited custom by means of open terror. Instead, he targeted the most vulnerable and the most contested practices, while relying heavily on preaching, ritual, charity, miracle, discipline, and local church structures to narrow the range of acceptable religious life. In the end, the real question was not whether the rural population would become Christian in some formal sense. That process was already well advanced. The deeper question was what kind of Christianity would take root among them. The answer that emerged was not the pure ideal imagined by bishops, nor the survival of an untouched pagan past, but a lived community religion shaped by struggle, adaptation, and the demands of everyday life. After the Council of Vaison, Caesarius stood at the peak of his influence. His long campaign to reshape religious life had not achieved complete success, yet politically, he had gained remarkable authority. The bishops under his metropolitan leadership had repeatedly supported his reforms in several church councils. They had joined him in condemning opponents of his policies and had accepted his theological arguments about divine grace. Important aristocrats and churchmen had also backed these positions, giving his ideas a wide platform across southern Gaul. The political structure of the Ostrogothic kingdom had helped make this influence possible. When the Gothic ruler extended his authority over the rest of the region surrounding Arles, Caesarius was able to exercise in practice the metropolitan authority he had long claimed in theory. Papal support strengthened his position even further. Several popes granted privileges to the women's monastery he had founded, and confirmed his decisions in disputes with other bishops. By the late 520s, it appeared that the Bishop of Arles had successfully established himself as a powerful religious leader whose authority stretched far beyond his own city. Yet this favourable situation began to unravel within only a few years. The political environment that had allowed Caesarius to build his influence was fragile, and it depended on alliances that he could not fully control. Within a short time, he would lose much of the support that had sustained his authority. Changes in the Gothic court, tensions within the church hierarchy, and new struggles for power across Europe all began to reshape the world in which he operated. When the Gothic king died in 526, power passed to his young grandson. The boy's mother governed as regent, and she faced a difficult task. She had to maintain the delicate balance that had defined the previous reign. The Gothic court had always tried to combine loyalty to its own traditions with a strong connection to Roman culture and institutions. Without the authority of a powerful king or the military leadership needed to command Gothic warriors, maintaining that balance became far more difficult. Political tension soon appeared within the Gothic ruling class. Some nobles favoured closer ties with the Roman Empire in Constantinople, while others feared that too much cooperation with the empire would weaken Gothic independence. The regent herself favoured peaceful relations with the emperor and the Roman elite. But powerful figures in her government held different views, and several ambitious leaders saw opportunities to advance their own interests during this unstable period. By the early 530s, the situation had become dangerous. A conspiracy formed among opponents, who accused the regent of raising the young king too much in Roman fashion and not enough according to Gothic traditions. She responded decisively, and removing the leading conspirators from positions of power and arranging their deaths. For the moment, supporters of closer cooperation with the empire regained control of the government. At the same time, external threats began to multiply. Frankish rulers to the north continued expanding their territory toward the Mediterranean. Their armies pushed into Burgundy and advanced dangerously close to the lands of southern Gaul. Another Frankish leader even reached the region near Arles before withdrawing. Faced with these pressures, the Gothic government attempted to strengthen its defences by reorganising frontier territories. Some border regions were returned to neighbouring rulers in order to create more manageable defensive lines. These decisions reshaped the political map of the region and directly affected Caesarius. When lands north of the Durance River were handed back to other rulers, the dioceses located in those territories were no longer under his metropolitan authority. For a time the change was unclear, and bishops from those areas continued attending councils in Provence as if nothing had happened. But soon their absence from later gatherings showed that Caesarius had permanently lost control over those northern churches. Political instability in Italy also influenced the church in Rome. During the years following the death of the Gothic king, several popes were chosen under conditions shaped by Gothic influence. Their elections were contested by factions within the Roman clergy and Senate, who favoured stronger ties with the Eastern Empire. These struggles affected Caesarius directly, because he often relied on papal support to strengthen his authority in Gaul. One example appeared when he sought confirmation of the theological decisions made at an earlier council dealing with the doctrine of grace. Some bishops in Gaul still opposed those conclusions. Caesarius wrote to the Pope expecting quick support, but the political turmoil in Rome delayed the response. When confirmation finally arrived, it helped both sides. Caesarius gained papal backing for his theological position, while the Pope strengthened his own fragile authority by presenting himself as the defender of orthodoxy. Despite this success, the need to request papal approval revealed the limits of Caesarius's power. His authority as metropolitan and papal representative in Gaul was less secure than it sometimes appeared. This weakness became especially visible in a major dispute involving the Bishop of Arles. The bishop in question was an influential figure, both senior in rank and well connected among the aristocracy. Although he had previously supported Caesarius in church councils, serious accusations were eventually brought against him. These included charges of immoral conduct and the improper sale of church property. When a council gathered to judge the case, the bishop admitted guilt and agreed to perform public penance while repaying what he had taken. The council, however, could not agree on the punishment. Some bishops believed he should be suspended only during his period of penance. Others argued that he should be permanently removed from office. Caesarius supported the harsher penalty, but several of his colleagues refused to accept that outcome. The disagreement was so deep that the council failed to reach a final decision. Faced with this challenge to his authority, Caesarius again appealed to the Bishop of Rome. The Pope supported his position and ordered the suspension of the accused bishop. A temporary administrator was to manage the diocese until a replacement could be chosen. Caesarius then circulated this decision along with a forceful letter urging the bishops of his province to obey. The tone of that letter reveals how serious the opposition had become. Some bishops clearly believed that Caesarius had pushed the case too far. Their reluctance to enforce the punishment showed that his influence over them was weakening. Events soon proved that papal support could shift quickly. A new pope came to power in Rome shortly afterward. The accused bishop appealed his case once again, this time to the new pontiff, Because the new pope was not closely tied to earlier political alliances, he reopened the matter. A new investigation was ordered under Roman supervision, and the bishop was temporarily allowed to return to his city while the case was reconsidered. This decision effectively overturned the earlier support given to Caesarius. It demonstrated that the Bishop of Arles could no longer rely on the papacy to guarantee his authority. At the same time, the new pope issued another unfavourable ruling by refusing Caesarius permission to distribute certain church properties to support charitable projects. The refusal marked another sign that his political influence was declining. During these same years, Caesarius turned his attention to protecting the women's monastery he had founded. From the beginning, he had placed leadership of the community in the hands of his own family members. But he understood that such an arrangement could not continue indefinitely. As he grew older, he began preparing legal and institutional protections that would allow the monastery to survive independently after his death. He produced a final version of the monastic rule and added a detailed summary of its regulations. The document emphasized strict enclosure, the rejection of private property, and the discipline required for communal religious life. At the same time, it introduced important changes intended to protect the community from interference by future bishops. The nuns themselves would now choose their abbess, rather than receiving one appointed by the Bishop of Arles. The rule also warned future leaders not to alter its provisions in ways that might weaken the independence or security of the monastery. Caesarius strengthened these protections through legal documents as well. He prepared a final testament that distributed his personal belongings and confirmed earlier arrangements, securing the monastery's resources. The will carefully described the lands and properties connected to the monastery and urged future bishops to respect these rights. It also emphasized that gifts made by donors for the benefit of the monastery must remain dedicated to that purpose. These measures were not merely administrative. Caesarius knew that monasteries often faced pressure from bishops who sought to control their property or influence their leadership. By placing his wishes into a formal testament and by gathering earlier documents that supported the monastery's privileges, he created a legal shield for the community he had founded. While these preparations were taking shape, another dramatic transformation occurred in the political world around Arles. War broke out between the Byzantine Empire and the Ostrogothic kingdom. Imperial armies advanced into Gothic territory, and the Gothic rulers struggled to defend their lands. In order to concentrate their forces in Italy, they negotiated an agreement with the Frankish kings to the north. Under this agreement, the Goths surrendered their territories in Gaul. Provence, including the city of Arles, passed into the hands of the Frankish king Childebert. The transfer took place peacefully, but it changed the balance of power across the region. Some observers accused Caesarius of welcoming the Frankish takeover because the Franks were Catholic, while the Goths followed Arian Christianity. Such accusations were not surprising, especially from Gothic supporters who feared losing influence. Yet the situation was far more complicated. Although the arrival of a Catholic ruler might appear favourable, it also threatened the independence that Caesarius had enjoyed under the Gothic administration. The Franks retained most of the existing administrative system in Provence. Roman officials continued their duties, though new leaders gradually replaced the old ones. Local councils still functioned, and the structure of government remained largely familiar. What changed most dramatically was the structure of ecclesiastical authority. Before the Frankish takeover, Caesarius had dominated the Church of Provence as its only metropolitan bishop. After the annexation, however, the region became part of a much larger Frankish kingdom that contained many powerful bishops and several metropolitan centres. Caesarius now stood as only one among many leading church figures, rather than the uncontested authority of the region. Frankish kings also showed a greater willingness to intervene directly in church matters. Church councils now met within the Frankish political sphere, often far from Provence. At one such gathering shortly after the annexation, neither Caesarius nor any bishop from his province attended. Whether this absence resulted from political uncertainty or deliberate protest remains unclear. But it revealed that the Church's centre of gravity had shifted away from Arles. When bishops from Provence eventually attended a later council, another challenge appeared. The Bishop of Aix attempted to restore his own metropolitan status by presenting himself as equal to the leading bishops of the kingdom. Caesarius himself did not attend that council, perhaps because of age or illness, but his absence allowed rivals to strengthen their claims. These developments showed that the world in which Caesarius had built his authority no longer existed. The political landscape had changed, and with it the structure of the Church. The Roman world that had shaped his career was fading, replaced by a new order dominated by the Merovingian kings of the Franks. Caesarius died in August 542 at the age of 72. Accounts of his final days follow the familiar style used in many stories about holy men. They describe a final illness, visions of heavenly glory, and a peaceful acceptance of death. Shortly before he died, he addressed the nuns of his monastery, reminding them of the community he had founded and the life of discipline he had required. After his death, the people of Arles mourned widely. Stories soon circulated about miracles associated with his relics. Such narratives were not merely expressions of devotion. They also helped establish his reputation as a saint and create a focus for religious veneration. His burial place played an important role in this process. Instead of being buried with the other bishops of Arles, Caesarius chose to rest in the church connected to the women's monastery he had founded. This decision protected the monastery in a final and symbolic way. The presence of his tomb transformed the church into a sacred centre associated with his memory and power. Pilgrims who visited the site could honour the relics of a holy bishop while also strengthening the position of the monastery that guarded them. Donations and gifts often followed such devotion, helping the community survive in the years after its founder's death. Stories of miracles reinforce this connection. Saints were believed not only to bless their followers, but also to defend the institutions dedicated to them. Fear of their supernatural protection could discourage anyone who might attempt to harm or plunder the monastery. After the death of Caesarius, the full impact of Frankish rule over Arles and its church only gradually became visible. Royal authority increasingly shaped the life of the city and its religious institutions. Kings influenced the selection of bishops, intervened in the status of papal representatives, showed growing interest in local monasteries, and over time contributed to the decline of Arles as a political and ecclesiastical centre. The developments that unfolded between the mid-6th century and the rise of Charles Martel reveal how these changes transformed both the city and the wider church in Gaul. When Caesarius died in 542, the Frankish king Childebert had the opportunity to place one of his own loyal supporters on the episcopal throne of Arles. Instead, he confirmed the choice of the local clergy. They had elected a priest named Auxanius, and his selection was praised by the Bishop of Rome as a legitimate and orderly election. Yet the circumstances surrounding Auxanius soon revealed how much the balance of power had shifted. Despite his appointment, he had to wait more than 2 years before receiving the authority traditionally granted to the Bishop of Arles as papal representative. By this time, such recognition depended not only on the Pope, but also on the approval of secular rulers. When Auxanius finally received the title in 545, his jurisdiction was limited to his own province and to the territories ruled by Childebert. This restriction clearly showed how the independence of the Church was increasingly constrained by royal authority. Auxanius died only a year later, before he could fully exercise his powers. His successor was chosen very differently. This time, the king intervened directly. Childebert appointed Aurelianus, a young man only 23 years old and closely connected to an influential political family. The decision demonstrated the growing role of royal influence in episcopal appointments. Aurelianus quickly received papal recognition and rose to prominence in the Frankish Church. His close relationship with the king was evident in their cooperation in founding new religious institutions within the city. Together, they established monasteries for both men and women in Arles. The royal family took great interest in these foundations, which were richly endowed and carefully organized. Relics of well-known saints were placed in the new monastery for men, including the relics of Caesarius himself. These new institutions were granted significant privileges, such as the right to manage their own property and elect their own leaders. At the same time, Aurelianus composed monastic rules for them that closely followed the earlier rules written by Caesarius. Although these new monasteries did not directly threaten the existence of the older communities founded by Caesarius, they did challenge their unique prestige. The earlier monasteries had once stood alone as the principal religious institutions of the city. Now, they shared the landscape with well-funded foundations supported by royal patronage. By associating themselves with the memory of Caesarius and adopting rules modelled on his writings, the new monasteries also competed for the spiritual authority linked to his reputation. Aurelianus died in the early 550s and was succeeded by Sapordus, a bishop closely connected with the governing elite of Provence. During his tenure, the Church of Arles still enjoyed significant influence. He presided over important gatherings of bishops and maintained close relations with both kings and popes. Yet the political foundations of the city's prominence were already beginning to weaken. A decisive moment came after the death of King Childebert in 558. The Frankish kingdom was soon divided among rival rulers, and Provence itself was split between competing territories. Arles came under the authority of Guntram, while nearby regions were controlled by another king whose administrative centre was established in Marseille. This shift gradually reduced the political importance of Arles. Marseille increasingly became the administrative focus of the region. Although the Bishop of Arles technically retained his metropolitan rank, the city's diminished political status weakened its influence within the wider church. Earlier popes had granted special authority to the bishops of Arles, partly because the city had been a major provincial capital. As that status faded, the justification for its special ecclesiastical role also declined. Later, bishops of Arles continued to hold their position but with less prestige than their predecessors. Royal officials played a growing role in their appointment. Papal recognition of their authority often came slowly or carried fewer privileges than before. At the same time, political conflicts among Frankish rulers created an unstable environment that further reduced the influence of the city. The fortunes of the church in Arles reflected broader changes across the Frankish world. After the early 7th century, royal power weakened in many regions. Local dukes and aristocratic leaders gained greater independence. Bishops were often closely tied to these local elites through family connections and shared interests. As a result, many church leaders became more involved in political affairs and less concerned with the spiritual discipline that earlier reformers had emphasized. Councils held during this period reveal growing concern about the behavior of clergy and bishops. Church leaders complained that many bishops neglected their duties, failed to preach regularly, and spent their time hunting or engaging in worldly pursuits. Some carried weapons or lived lifestyles that appeared little different from those of secular nobles. These criticisms suggest that the ideals of earlier reformers were losing influence. In fact, church councils became increasingly rare. For long stretches of time, there were no large gatherings of bishops to coordinate reform or enforce discipline. In this environment, monasteries rather than episcopal centres often preserved traditions of religious learning and reform. Communities devoted to monastic life copied religious texts, collected church laws, and maintained intellectual traditions that might otherwise have disappeared. Meanwhile, the political structure of the Frankish world continued to fragment. After the death of the powerful king, Dagobert in the 7th century, authority passed to young heirs who ruled under the influence of powerful nobles. Local rulers in regions such as Provence acted with increasing independence from the central monarchy. Bishops often cooperated with these regional leaders rather than with distant kings. This long period of political instability lasted for nearly a century. Only in the 8th century did a new leader begin to restore unity across the Frankish territories. Charles Martel, a powerful military commander, gradually consolidated control over several regions of the Frankish world. After defeating Muslim forces advancing into Western Europe in the early 8th century, he turned his attention towards strengthening his authority across Gaul. In the 730s, he launched campaigns to bring regions such as Burgundy and Provence firmly under his control. Local rulers in Provence attempted to resist and even sought help from outside powers. Muslim forces from nearby territories briefly occupied several cities, including Arles, and raided the surrounding countryside. Charles Martel eventually defeated these forces and reasserted Frankish authority over the region. By the time he died in the early 740s, the political situation had been fundamentally transformed. Provence was once again firmly integrated into the Frankish realm, and the foundations were laid for the emergence of a new ruling dynasty. Power passed to Charles's son, Pippin, who would later become the first king of the Carolingian dynasty. Looking back across these centuries, it becomes clear that the efforts of Caesarius to promote religious reform had always depended heavily on political circumstances. Within his own city, he could rely on cooperation from local clergy and aristocrats. But beyond Arles, he required the support of other bishops, the Bishop of Rome, and secular rulers. When the political structure of the region changed after the Frankish conquest, those alliances had to be renegotiated. Because Caesarius died soon after the Frankish takeover, he never had the opportunity to embed most of his reforms firmly within the institutions of the new kingdom. Some of his ideas survived in church councils that followed. Regulations concerning the ordination of clergy and certain aspects of church discipline were adopted in later gatherings of bishops. Yet many of his proposals were never widely implemented. Other reforms proved more difficult to maintain. Rules designed to strengthen the role of local clergy in rural areas gradually disappeared from later church legislation. This decline suggests that many bishops no longer considered these reforms important or practical. One reason for this shift was the changing character of the episcopate itself. By the 7th century, many bishops came from powerful aristocratic families and measured their status by wealth, influence, and political connections. They often controlled large estates and used their positions to strengthen family networks. These bishops were far less inclined to embrace programs that demanded personal austerity, shared authority with lower clergy, or required extensive pastoral travel among rural populations. For this reason, it is striking that the ideas associated with Caesarius did not disappear entirely. After lying dormant for nearly 2 centuries, many of them resurfaced during a later wave of reform in the 8th and 9th centuries. Reformers of that era sought to create a more disciplined and unified Christian society. In doing so, they rediscovered writings and traditions that echoed the earlier vision promoted by Caesarius. The revival of those ideas did not happen simply because people remembered his name. Many of his writings circulated anonymously and were valued less for their author than for their practical usefulness. They provided clear instructions about preaching, church discipline, and the moral responsibilities of both clergy and laity. For reformers seeking to reshape society according to Christian ideals, such texts offered valuable guidance. They preserved a vision of religious life that emphasized moral discipline, charity toward the poor, education of the clergy, and regular preaching to the faithful. Under new political conditions, those ideas would once again influence attempts to build a Christian social order across Western Europe. Although the results of these efforts were mixed, their long-term impact was significant. Over time, the parish system became deeply rooted in everyday life. Local churches shaped community identity, organized charitable activity, and connected religious practice to the rhythms of ordinary existence. In this way, the ideals once promoted by Caesarius continued to influence the structure of Christian society long after the world in which he had lived had disappeared.